Just before 8:00 the evening on the 3rd of September, 1981, a 31-year-old woman named Linda Slayton stood in her small kitchen in Lakeland, Florida. She was staring into her cupboard, and what she saw was not encouraging. The shelves were nearly bare. There were a couple of cans of beans, a bag of flour, and not much else. And seeing this sight, this emptiness, it gave Linda a familiar pit in her stomach. It was the feeling of knowing she had to somehow stretch these very few ingredients into a real, filling meal for her two growing boys. Linda was a single mother. She had two sons, Jeff, who was 15, and Tim, who was 12. And to say money was tight would be an understatement. Linda didn't have much at all. So, in order to make sure her kids were taken care of, she had to be incredibly resourceful. She had to be creative. This meant doing things like finding a way to make a real dinner out of just beans and flour. It also meant she would often make her kids, their clothes, herself, anything she could do to save a few dollars here and there. It was a constant struggle, but she did it for them. Up until just a few weeks ago, the family had been living in Alabama. But Linda had made the big decision to move them all to Lakeland, Florida. And she did this for a very specific reason. She had a lot of family and a strong support system there. Her sister lived there, her parents were nearby. And so Linda had really been hoping that with all that support, things would finally start to look up for her and her sons. She hoped their lives would improve, that it wouldn't feel like such a constant, grinding struggle all the time anymore. But so far, the big move to Lakeland had just felt like more of the same. The fresh start hadn't quite materialized yet. Linda was having a hard time finding a steady job, which was the cornerstone of her plan. So, in the meantime, she and the boys were getting by on government assistance and food stamps. But it never seemed to be enough. Especially not enough to keep two teenage boys, one of whom was an athlete, well-fed, and happy. And tonight was a perfect example of that pressure. Her youngest son, Tim, was due to be dropped off any minute. He had been at football practice, and Linda knew from experience that when he came home from practice, he was always starving. So she really, really wanted to have a hot dinner ready and waiting for him when he walked through the door. On top of that, there was another reason she wanted to get dinner done quickly. Linda was hopeful that if Tim and her other son Jeff ate fast enough, they would all have enough time to make it over to a neighbor's housewarming party later that evening. You see, all the neighbors in their new complex were basically as new as she was. The entire housing development had only been open for about 3 weeks. It was a big, sprawling development with around 81-story duplexes. Technically, it was government-subsidized housing, but it didn't really feel like it. It had more of a classic suburban feel. The units were arranged on quiet cul-de-sacs with neat little lawns where all the neighborhood kids would go outside and play together. It felt safe. It felt like a community. Linda's own sister, Judy, also lived in this same complex, which was a huge comfort. So Linda already knew at least one person very well. But for Linda, making friends of her own was also really important. She was an outgoing, friendly person by nature, and she was also newly single. She wanted to meet people and take her mind off her recent ex-boyfriend. Until just a little while ago, Linda had been dating a guy named Brendan Fowler. He had been really great at first. In fact, he was the one who had told her about this apartment complex in the first place. But over time, he'd started to get really controlling and possessive. It became suffocating. And just 2 days ago, Linda had finally gathered the strength to end things with him for good. And believe it or not, despite the empty cupboards and the job hunt, Linda was actually feeling sort of hopeful. She had believed that leaving Alabama and moving to Florida into this new complex, that this would be the big refresh that she and her kids so desperately needed. But now, she was starting to think that maybe the true reset, the real start, was the breakup with Brendan just a couple of days earlier. It was like all these big changes needed to happen together in order for their lives to really get on the right track. She felt like she was finally shedding all the old baggage. So, feeling a little bit optimistic, Linda looked back into the cupboard at her very limited ingredients. And suddenly, An idea sparked. She could actually make a quick bean casserole with just these few things. It wouldn't be fancy, but it would be hot and filling. So she reached in, grabbed the cans and the bag of flour, set them on the counter, and she got to work. About a half an hour later, the smell of baking filled the small duplex. Linda pulled a beautiful golden brown casserole out of the oven and set it on the counter to cool down. And that's when her older son, Jeff, wandered into the kitchen. He saw the casserole and immediately asked if dinner was ready. Linda told him it was, but she explained that they needed to wait for his brother Tim to get home from football practice first before they could all eat together. And when she said that, something in Jeff just snapped. He sort of blew up at her. He said he was really hungry right now, and he complained that there was basically no other food in the house, so he couldn't even grab a snack to tide himself over. He just kept saying, "Come on, let me eat now." Now, Jeff's reaction made Linda pretty mad. But at the same time, it didn't really surprise her. He was 15, and he had been talking back to her a lot lately. It seemed like the two of them were fighting all the time over small things. Linda knew, deep down, that he was sort of just being a typical teenager. And he was really hungry, she got that. He was testing her limits. But she was just getting so tired of the constant conflict. And so before she could even really think about what she was saying, she snapped right back at him. She said, "Well, if you don't like it here, you can leave." And at that, Jeff didn't hesitate. He literally stormed out of the house and slammed the front door shut behind him. The sound echoed through the quiet duplex. Linda went over to the front window and watched as her son grabbed his bike from the lawn and pedaled off angrily down the road, disappearing around the corner. After he was gone, Linda let out a long sigh. She walked over to her phone and she called her mom. She assumed, correctly, that Jeff would probably head straight to his grandparents' house since they lived nearby. And when Linda's mother picked up the phone, Linda warned her that Jeff might be showing up soon and that he would probably be hungry and looking to eat. Her mom said that was perfectly fine, not to worry, and that they would make sure he had dinner and then drop him back off at home afterwards. Then her mom's tone changed. She said she was actually glad that Linda had called because another letter had arrived in the mail for her. And as soon as Linda heard the word letter, she felt this cold wave of anxiety wash over her. She knew exactly what kind of letter her mother was talking about. Linda's ex-husband, the father of Tim and Jeff, was a man named Frank Slayton. He still lived back in Alabama. He was a violent, abusive alcoholic, and they had been divorced for 7 long years. But even after all that time, Frank had never stopped harassing Linda. He just wouldn't let go. And ever since Linda and the boys had moved to Lakeland, he had started mailing these threatening letters to Linda's parents' house. In them, he would ramble on about how Linda had ruined his life. And so now, Linda was standing there on the phone, thinking that no matter how many fresh starts she tried to create for her family, it seemed like Frank was always going to find a way to screw them up. He was a dark cloud that was never going to go away. And so, after taking a deep, calming breath, Linda told her mom on the phone to just rip the letter up. She didn't even want to see it. She didn't want to read the words. She just wanted it gone. Not long after she hung up the phone with her mother, her younger son Tim came in through the front door. He was all sweaty and covered in dirt from football practice, but he had a smile on his face. And right away, Linda asked him, "Hey, did you thank your coach for giving you a ride home?" And Tim nodded and said, "Yes, I did." You see, Linda didn't have a car. She couldn't afford one. So Tim's football coach always had to give him a ride home from practice. Linda always made sure Tim was polite about it. Tim assured her, "I thanked him, like always," and so Linda told him to hurry up and get his food because they had to go next door to the neighbor's party soon. Hours later, after 11 p.m. that evening, Linda and Tim were walking home from the party, making their way through the dark and quiet apartment complex. There had been about 7 other people at the party, and it had been a lot of fun. It was simple. Everybody just drank iced tea and played card games while they talked about the perks of living in this great new complex. They talked about the convenient business district right across the street and how responsive and helpful the maintenance team was. It was exactly the kind of friendly neighborhood feeling Linda had been hoping for. So she was glad they went. She was also completely exhausted. And she knew her sister always came over for coffee first thing in the morning, so she needed to get to bed now or she would never be able to wake up on time. However, when she and Tim got back to their unit and she opened the front door, Linda froze right there in the doorway. Because there was already somebody inside their home, for a split second her heart jumped, thinking it might be an intruder. But then her eyes adjusted to the dim light, and she realized it was just her older son, Jeff. He had come back. He was standing in the kitchen, leaning against the counter. He had a sort of, "I'm sorry" expression on his face. He looked guilty. Tim, her younger son, saw the situation, understood what was happening, and immediately and quietly disappeared into the second bedroom to give his mother and his brother some space to talk. Linda walked into the kitchen to join Jeff. He didn't say anything at first. So, Linda decided to speak first. She gently reminded him that it was never a good idea to go to bed angry. However, Jeff still didn't say anything. He just looked down at the floor. And Linda knew from plenty of experience with her son that it was better not to force him to talk when he was like this. So she decided she would just give him a minute. She turned her back to him and began quietly washing the few dishes that were in the sink, giving him time to collect his thoughts. Finally, after a few moments of silence, she mumbled that he loved his mom. And Linda smiled. She felt this huge sense of relief that they could just move on from their silly fight. She turned around and told him it was all good, and that she loved him too. Then they both said goodnight. Jeff went over to the cot in the living room where he slept. And Linda finished up in the kitchen, turned off all the lights, and headed into her own bedroom. She closed her door behind her, and she went to bed. The next morning at 8:30 a.m., Linda's sister, Judy Butler, walked up the path to Linda's duplex. They had a routine. They had coffee together every single morning since they had both moved to the neighborhood. So, Judy expected this morning to be like any other. She would knock on her sister's door, and Linda would open it, and she would go right in. But this time, after she knocked, nobody answered. There was just silence. So, Judy waited a moment, and then she knocked again, a little bit louder this time. And when there was still no response, Judy reached down and she tried the doorknob. But she found it was locked. This had never happened before. Linda always answered the door, or at least called out to say she was coming. But Judy wasn't really worried. Not yet. She just figured that Linda must have overslept or something. They had been at that party last night, after all. So Judy decided she would just go home for now and let her sister have a few more minutes of sleep. She figured eventually she would just call the house to check in on her and make sure she was okay. However, as she started to walk away from the home, she noticed something strange on the side of Linda's duplex. One of the back windows was missing its screen. The screen was just gone. And Judy knew that that particular window belonged to Linda's bedroom. And she was sure that it hadn't been like that yesterday. So, seeing it now, it made her feel a little bit uneasy. A small knot of concern started to form in her stomach. So, she walked off the path and over to the side of the house to get a closer look. She went right up to the window and peered inside. And when she looked in, she saw her sister. Linda was in her bed, and she looked like she was fast asleep. And for a second, Judy was just relieved. This confirmed her theory. Her sister had just overslept. That's all this was. But then, as she kept looking, Judy realized there was something off about the way Linda was lying there. The way she was positioned, it just seemed wrong. It was unnatural. And then, in a horrifying flash, everything clicked into place for her. Her brain finally processed what her eyes were seeing. And in that moment, she staggered backwards away from the window and began to scream. By 9 a.m. on the 4th of September 1981, a crowd of reporters and police officers had surrounded the duplex in the Lakeland, Florida housing complex where a woman had reported seeing a dead body. In the middle of all the chaotic activity, Sergeant Edgar Pickett of the Lakeland Police ducked under a line of yellow crime scene tape. He headed towards the home's front walkway with a heavy bag of equipment slung over his shoulder. Now, Pickett was a veteran officer. He was actually just 1 year away from retirement after 2 long decades as a detective. And for the last few years of his career, he'd been the head of Lakeland's crime scene unit. This meant he was the one who oversaw the collection and the documentation of all the evidence at major crime scenes. So, while he wasn't the lead investigator on this particular case, when it came to the meticulous work of forensic analysis and fingerprint collection, he was the best they had. He'd already been briefed on the situation on his way over. He knew that this was very likely a homicide. The victim had been identified as 1-year-old Linda Slayton. He knew that Linda had been found in her bedroom by her sister, who had then flagged down a nearby maintenance worker and asked him to call 911. Pickett also knew that when the first responding officers got inside the house, they found that Linda's 2 kids were still asleep in their beds. They appeared to have absolutely no idea that their mother was deceased just in the next room. And Pickett knew right away that this fact would give the investigators a rough timeline to start with. It meant Linda was clearly alive when her kids went to sleep, and she must have died sometime during the night while they were still sleeping. As Pickett walked up the walkway towards the front door, he passed by 2 teenage boys who were sitting in their pajamas on the grass just outside the tape. He assumed, correctly, that these must be the sons. One of them just sort of stared straight ahead, his face a blank mask, seemingly in complete shock. The other, younger one, was sobbing quietly into his brother's shoulder. Pickett wasn't sure if any of the other officers had spoken to them yet, but he knew that they would likely be really helpful in focusing his search for evidence. Since they lived in the house, they would know the habits and the patterns of everyone who lived there. They might be able to tell him if anything at all seemed out of place. So, Pickett made a mental note to make sure to check in with the investigators who were already inside about that. Then, he stopped at the front door, looked at the house, and took a deep breath. Pickett liked to get a sort of first impression of a crime scene before he did any actual evidence collection. It was his process. So before he would go inside, he would do a slow walk around the entire exterior of the house and sort of assess the building. He had been told that all the doors were locked when the first police officers got there. And from what he could see now, the bedroom window with the missing screen was the only visible sign of a potential break-in. So he took out his kit and he spent some time carefully dusting around that window area for prints. But he didn't find much there. And he also didn't see any noticeable shoe impressions in the soft dirt outside beneath the window. And then, when he finally headed inside, Pickett quickly moved past all the other officers and detectives that were already milling about in the living room and kitchen. He went straight to Linda's bedroom. And the very first thing he saw when he got inside was Linda's body on the bed. There was a thin metal coat hanger wrapped tightly around her throat. The bed sheets all around her were covered in blood. She was shirtless, and the bottom of her dress was pulled up around her waist. And when Pickett got a little closer, he could see where all the blood had come from. There were long, very deep scratches all over Linda's neck, which he guessed were from her own fingernails. It looked like she had desperately tried to pry the hanger away from her throat. He would have to wait for the official autopsy report, of course, but it was clear just from looking at her wounds that the hanger had been used to strangle her to death. And considering she was partially naked and the positioning of her clothes, he guessed she had also likely been sexually assaulted. Pickett took a step back and slowly looked around the rest of the room, trying to decide where he should even begin his work. He needed to find as much forensic evidence in this room as was humanly possible. So, the first thing he did was try to mentally reconstruct what might have happened. He tried to guess how the killer might have moved through and interacted with the crime scene. That way he could follow their sort of imagined path with more intention and focus. He figured the killer must have come in through that open window, since that was the only entrance into the house that was obviously tampered with. He noted that Linda's purse and her jewelry were still sitting untouched on the dresser. The drawers of the dresser were all closed, as opposed to being pulled open and rifled through. So, it didn't seem like the killer had touched any of that stuff, which also meant this was likely not a robbery that had gone wrong. In fact, it seemed like the first and only thing the killer had done after entering the room was attack Linda. Because aside from the bloody bed, Pickett didn't see any other signs of a struggle. There were no knocked-over lamps, no chairs out of place. It seemed to him that Linda was likely caught completely off guard by a very fast and sudden attack, and she was unable to really fight back quickly. Because if she had, the room would probably be a huge mess. But then, Pickett's eyes caught a glimpse of Linda's closet, and he noticed that the clothes inside were all hanging on thin metal hangers that looked absolutely identical to the one that was wrapped around Linda's neck. And that's when a new theory hit him. The killer must have, at some point, been inside that closet, hiding. He supposed it was possible the killer could have broken in first and then grabbed a hanger from the closet once the attack started. But that would have taken too much time. It would have been clumsy and noisy, and it also would have given Linda a chance to get off the bed, or fight back, or yell out, and maybe wake her sons up. It seemed much more likely, much more logical, that the killer had broken in earlier, before Linda even came home. He had hidden in the closet, and then he waited there in the dark until Linda was in her bed and asleep before he came out to attack. If Pickett was right about that, this murder became something very different. It was now a premeditated, thought-out murder, which meant the killer must have either known Linda personally or they had been watching her. They had been stalking her, because they would have had to have known her schedule, known when to sneak into the room and not be detected. At this point, Pickett took out his gear again and began thinking about how he was going to approach the evidence collection. He figured he would start at the window, since that was the point of entry. He would spend a lot of time there. And then he would move to the closet. Those would be his two primary areas of focus. And so, once he had that plan in his mind, he went back over to the window and he began meticulously looking for any trace evidence. And sure enough, after only a few minutes of carefully dusting the frame and the ledge, he smiled to himself. Because there, on the ledge, clear as day, was a very well-defined handprint. The following afternoon, over 24 hours after Linda's body had been found, Pickett sat in the precinct's fingerprint lab. He was hunched over a table, comparing two sets of prints with a large magnifying glass. He had been at it for hours already, and his head was pounding. After processing the crime scene the day before, Pickett had gone back to the station to review all the evidence he'd collected. And while he was there, he decided he would go check in with the lead detectives to get a full update on the case. And what they would tell him is that they had spoken to all of the neighbors, as well as Linda's family members, and they did have a few solid leads and a pretty clear timeline. According to Linda's kids, the older son Jeff had been dropped off at home at about 9:30 p.m. after being with his grandparents. Then Tim, the younger son, and Linda herself had gotten back from the neighbor's housewarming party just after 11 p.m. They had all gone to bed around midnight, and neither of the brothers had heard a single thing until the police woke them up the next morning. And all of this information had led the investigators to agree with Pickett's initial interpretation of the scene. Linda's attack had to have been very, very fast. It seemed like she had not been able to even scream, or else it almost certainly would have woken up her sons, especially Jeff, who was sleeping just on the other side of the wall. The autopsy report had also come in by then, and it confirmed that Linda had died from strangulation and that she had been sexually assaulted. The medical examiner had also been able to collect a semen sample from Linda's body, which meant they were definitely looking for a male perpetrator here. And since this was now clearly a sexually motivated crime, it meant that anybody Linda had been romantically involved with was now suddenly a top suspect. After speaking with Linda's family, the detectives had discovered that Linda had two serious ex-partners they needed to look at. There was her ex-husband, Frank Slayton, and her more recent ex-boyfriend, a man named Brendan Fowler. Frank, they learned, had apparently abused Linda when they were married, and he was still sending her very threatening letters even now. And Brendan was apparently very possessive and was known to have a bad temper. And Linda had broken up with him just 2 days before her murder. So some officers were already out looking for both of these men to bring them in for questioning. Pickett was eager to get both of their fingerprints. But for now, he was actually more focused on Linda's neighbors. When the detectives had done their initial canvass of the area, the neighbors they spoke to had confirmed that Linda and her younger son Tim were indeed at that party on the night she was killed. And since these neighbors were some of the last people to see Linda alive, they weren't just witnesses, they were also suspects. And so, Pickett had methodically collected fingerprints from all the men who had been at that party, specifically those who didn't have a solid alibi for the period of time after Linda went home. And that's what he was working on now, painstakingly comparing those prints to the clear print he had found on the windowsill. So far, none of them were a match. But they had also gotten blood samples from the neighbors, so Pickett would have to test those as well. In 1981, DNA testing as we know it didn't exist yet. But investigators could figure out somebody's blood type through various bodily fluids. So Pickett and his team could test those blood samples against the genetic material that was found on Linda's body, and at least rule out suspects that way. But Pickett had another, more urgent reason for wanting to be so diligent when it came to testing the people who lived in the complex. It was because, after Linda's murder, just in the last 24 hours, there had been signs that the killer might actually still be in the area. At 3 a.m. that morning, one of Linda's neighbors, a woman who lived just a few doors down, had called the police to report that a stranger had broken into her house. And even though that person was long gone by the time the police arrived, they could see that her back door had clearly been forced open. And then, another neighbor had called in to report that the screen on their window had been pried open as well. None of them were violent assaults like what had happened to Linda, but the timing was extremely suspicious. And it made Pickett wonder if there was a serial predator living right there in the complex. The department had ordered extra patrols in the area, and Pickett was supposed to get fingerprints for whoever they got calls about, so he was working with his police radio on right next to him, waiting for the next call. Pickett leaned back in his chair to give his tired eyes a rest. He knew he was getting pretty exhausted and would need to take a break soon. But just seconds later, a detective barged into the lab and told Pickett they needed him on standby for fingerprinting because they had just brought Linda's ex-boyfriend, Brendan, in for questioning. Moments later, Pickett was standing just outside of an interrogation room, listening as a couple of detectives spoke with Brendan Fowler inside. Even though he couldn't see Brendan, Pickett could tell just by the sound of his voice that he was not happy to be there. He sounded argumentative and very defensive as he insisted over and over that he had absolutely nothing to do with Linda's death. And when he was asked about where he was on the night she died, he had an alibi. He said he was at home with his family, and he stayed there the entire night. He even gave the detectives his mom's phone number and told them they should call her to confirm his story. Pickett heard the detectives inside confer in hushed voices. Then they asked Brendan if he would be willing to take a polygraph test and also let them take his fingerprints. And to Pickett's surprise, Brendan said, "Yeah, go ahead." And as soon as Pickett heard that, he knew from experience that he had to move fast. He went right inside the room and got Brendan's fingerprints before Brendan could change his mind or lawyer up. On September 11th, exactly 1 week after Linda's murder, Pickett sat down at his desk and opened the local newspaper. And what he saw on the front page made him cringe. The Lakeland police chief had just given an interview where he publicly admitted that they would not be making an arrest now or even in the next few days. And reading that in print was a stark reminder to Pickett of just how little progress they had actually made in this case. None of the neighbors' prints had been a match to the one Pickett had lifted off the windowsill. And they had tracked down Linda's ex-husband, Frank, but they found that he was all the way back in Alabama on the night Linda was killed with a solid alibi. As for Linda's ex-boyfriend, Brendan, he had seemed pretty guilty at first. During his polygraph test, the results had come back as inconclusive, which is always a red flag. And his alibi didn't completely check out either. His family had said that he was home at one point on the night Linda was killed, but they had all gone to sleep at some point and couldn't say for sure if maybe he had left the house later that night. But when Pickett had looked at Brendan's fingerprints, he had no choice but to clear him as a suspect. They clearly were not a match to the print from the scene. So now, Pickett knew the entire investigative team was scrambling for new leads, any leads at all. which was why Pickett was not surprised by what he saw when he looked up from his newspaper. He saw a detective leading a suspect out of a precinct interrogation room after clearly questioning him. And it was Linda's own 5-year-old son, Jeff Slayton. And he was obviously crying. Pickett had heard through the grapevine that Jeff was being looked into as a suspect in his own mother's murder and that he had already been questioned a few times. The detectives had started getting interested in him when a few of Linda's family members had mentioned that Jeff and Linda had been fighting a lot in the weeks before she died. And when the investigators looked back at the crime scene photos, they realized that Jeff's cot in the living room shared a wall with Linda's bedroom. So it seemed very strange to them that he hadn't heard a single thing on the night she had died. But as far as Pickett knew, Jeff had a reasonable explanation for all of this. He had said that his fights with his mother were not that serious. He explained that they did fight on the night she died, but it was over a dumb argument about what time they should eat dinner. And he said he had no idea why he didn't wake up when she was attacked. He said he wished he had, so he could have gone in there and tried to help her. And on top of all that, Jeff had taken and passed a polygraph test. But for some reason, it seemed like the investigative team was not done with Jeff yet. And Pickett just sort of felt bad for the kid. He thought it was very unlikely at this point that Jeff was his own mother's killer. Pickett had kids of his own. And from his own experience, the fights Jeff was having with his mom just seemed like typical teenage behavior. Teenagers squabble with their parents. It's pretty normal. And it also just didn't line up with the physical evidence. Pickett was absolutely certain that the attacker had broken in through the window. That didn't make any sense for Jeff if he was sleeping right next door in the living room. And most importantly, Pickett had personally checked Jeff's prints against the one he had lifted from the window, and he knew for a fact that it was not a match. As the days turned into weeks, Pickett was starting to become convinced that the killer might be somebody without a personal connection to Linda. Maybe it was even a complete stranger. He knew that murders by strangers were much more rare than murders committed by a relative, a partner, or a friend, which was why he assumed the other detectives weren't really pursuing that angle. But through his own forensic work, Pickett had now eliminated pretty much everyone in Linda's life who had a clear motive or the opportunity to kill her. And Linda was a very attractive young woman who was also very outgoing. Pickett thought it was entirely possible that the killer could be a stranger who had only interacted with her once, maybe saw her at the store, and then sort of became fixated on her. It seemed plausible. And so after Pickett watched Jeff leave with the detective, he tried to go back to reading his newspaper, but he couldn't focus. He kept thinking about Linda. He had been so sure that this case would be solved quickly by the forensics, by the evidence, but now he wasn't sure if it would be solved at all. And that worry only got stronger and stronger as the months went by, and fewer leads came in. And before long, a whole year had passed. And it was actually time for Pickett to retire. And when he walked out of the precinct for the very last time, he had a pit in his stomach because he had a terrible feeling that without him pushing for it, Linda's case was going to get put on a shelf and eventually forgotten. One afternoon in the fall of 2001, 2 full decades after Linda Slayton was murdered, a detective named Brad Grace sat in his office at the Lakeland Police Department. He was reading over Linda's thick, dusty cold case file. For the last 4 years, Grace had been tasked with sorting through the department's many cold cases and choosing which ones to officially reopen. And this had been a really slow and painstaking process because he had to do all of that while also juggling his active caseload. So even though he'd technically been assigned Linda's case for years, he was just now starting to really dig into it. But the delay didn't worry him too much. Because the whole reason this particular case had appealed to him in the first place was because he was sure he could solve it and solve it quickly. And that was because it had one crucial thing: DNA evidence. Back in 1981, when the murder actually happened, the genetic material that was found on Linda's body was only good for eliminating suspects through their blood type. But now, in 2001, Grace could use that very same material to create a full DNA profile of Linda's killer. and he intended on reaching out to everybody who was involved in the original investigation to get their DNA to test against this new profile. But before he did that, he wanted to completely familiarize himself with all the suspects from 1981. So there was Linda's ex-husband, Frank Slayton, who had abused Linda repeatedly during their marriage. And even though they had been divorced for years, he was apparently still sending her all these threatening letters right around the time of her murder. And then there was her more recent romantic partner, Brendan Fowler, who was known to have a bad temper and seemed to be very controlling of Linda. And they had broken up only 2 days before her murder, so he could have still been furious about it. The neighbors who were at the party Linda had gone to were also suspects. Everybody in that group knew when Linda was heading home, so it was possible somebody could have followed her and then snuck into her bedroom before she went to bed. And then finally, there was Jeff Slayton, Linda's oldest son, who was actually in the house during the murder. His brother Tim had been there too, of course, but Jeff had actually admitted to getting into a big fight with Linda earlier that same day. Now, all of these suspects had been cleared back in the day through fingerprints, alibis, or polygraphs, but Grace knew that DNA testing was way more accurate than any of those old methods of elimination. And so basically, even if they'd been ruled out for one of those three things, a DNA match would override all of that. And so he wasn't going to let these previous eliminations cloud his judgment. He had already decided that no matter what, he was just going to focus on whatever the forensics told him and not be biased by the old investigation. But for now, he just wanted to kick things off by speaking with the two people who had known Linda better than anybody else in the world, her sons, Tim and Jeff. A few days later, Grace walked into a small meeting room at the precinct where he'd been told Jeff and Tim Slayton were waiting for him. And as soon as he saw the two brothers, he just started laughing. Because he realized he already knew Jeff Slayton. They had bowled together in a local league for years. But it had never occurred to Grace that this Jeff Slayton, the victim's son, was the same Jeff from his bowling team. And Jeff recognized Grace at the exact same time. So they spent a little while talking and laughing about what a crazy, small-world coincidence this was. And so when Grace finally sat down with Jeff and with Tim, the atmosphere was already a bit more relaxed. Grace's first line of questioning wasn't about the case at all. It was just personal. He just asked them, hey, how are you guys holding up after all these years? How have you dealt with this horrible thing? And for the next few minutes, the mood in the room got pretty heavy as the two brothers spoke honestly about how terrible the last 20 years had been for them. After their mother had been killed, they both said that they were terrified that they were going to get hurt too. Because the killer was never caught, they always felt like they were looking over their shoulder, wondering who was going to be next. Jeff said he started sleeping with a knife under his pillow. He eventually got so depressed that he dropped out of high school. And Tim admitted that he also struggled a lot, but he took a different path. He relied on his football team and his friends for support. He kept pictures of all of them around his room to remind himself to try and stay positive. After that, the brothers shared what they could remember about the night their mother had died. But it was obvious to Grace that Tim and Jeff didn't really have any new information that he didn't already have inside the case file. So instead of continuing to question them about the details of the case, Grace explained to them that this murder was going to be solved through DNA. And because of that, he needed to collect DNA samples from every single person who was involved in this case back in the day. And that, he explained, included both of them. The brothers looked surprised for a moment, but then they both nodded and said, "Of course, whatever you need." So Grace stood up and said he would send a lab technician inside to get their samples. But before he left the room, he looked both of them in the eye, and he promised them that he would find their mom's killer. He told them he was not going to retire until he did. Later that month, Grace sat in front of a computer screen in the station's computer lab, reading a police report from 1982. Since speaking to the two Slayton brothers, Grace had collected DNA from dozens of people who were involved in the case. From 1981, he got samples from Jeff, Tim, and also Linda's ex-husband, Frank Slayton, and her ex-boyfriend, Brendan Fowler. He'd also tested the old blood samples that the original investigators had gotten from Linda's neighbors. But none of them, not a single one, matched the DNA profile for Linda's killer. This was hugely disappointing because it meant that Grace had to basically start from scratch. But when he had gone back to the original case notes, he noticed the mention of those other break-ins that had happened around the complex shortly after Linda's murder. And it made him wonder if Linda was killed by a serial predator who was just active in the area at the time. And if that was true, then this person probably would not have just hurt Linda. They would have other victims too. So Grace had run the killer's DNA through the FBI's national database. And when it didn't match anything in there, he had reached out to the local county sheriff's department to see if they could send him any cases from that era that felt similar to Linda's. And they had sent over the very report that he was reading right now. And it felt incredibly promising. In 1982, just a year after Linda's murder, a man named Jimmy Murr was arrested for climbing through a 10-year-old girl's bedroom window and then assaulting and strangling her. And according to his file, Jimmy had a long history of home invasions and very violent behavior. And as soon as Grace finished reading the report, he jumped up from his chair and went to go find one of his officers. He wanted to dig up as much information on this Jimmy Murr as he possibly could and see if maybe they could go track him down. About a month later, Grace sat at his desk, staring at his phone in anxious anticipation. He was waiting for an incredibly important phone call, one that would confirm whether or not Jimmy Murr was Linda's killer. After doing a deep background check on Jimmy, Grace had found out that Jimmy actually knew someone who lived at Linda's complex. And he was literally staying with them at their duplex at the same time Linda was killed. Now, Jimmy himself was not alive anymore, but they had managed to get in touch with his mother, who had agreed to give them her DNA. And they were testing it now. This DNA would not be an exact match to the killer's DNA, of course, but it would show if she was at least a close relative of the killer. And as Grace waited for the lab to call, his heart was pounding in his chest. Because for the first time since he'd picked up Linda's case, everything finally seemed to make sense. Jimmy was a violent serial home invader. He had probably seen Linda while he was staying at his friend's house, and maybe he stalked her for a few days until he saw an opportunity to attack. And then, after he killed her, he must have compulsively kept breaking into other homes in the complex to try and find more victims. It all fit. Just then, his phone rang. Grace snatched it up. He could feel his mouth going dry as he heard it was the lab on the other end of the line. He was going to get his answer right here, right now. But just a second later, they told him the news. It was not a match. Grace's stomach dropped. But he managed to thank them anyway, and he hung up the phone. He couldn't believe it. Despite all the suspects and all the modern forensic evidence that they had, this case was once again at a dead end. Still, Grace kept pushing forward. As the months turned into years, he would regularly find new potential suspects, and he would eventually clear them one by one. He also kept sending the killer's DNA profile to the FBI to run it through their database, just in case any new additions were added in that could be a match. But eventually, over a decade passed by, and Grace still had not been able to match anybody to the killer's DNA. And in 2015, his own health began to decline. And he finally had to make the phone call he hoped he would never have to make. He picked up the phone, and he dialed Jeff Slayton's number. And when Jeff picked up, Grace told him that he had to retire. And that he was sorry, but he still had not found his mother's killer. In June of 2019, 4 years into his retirement, Brad Grace sat on the deck of his Florida home reading a newspaper. He was deep into an article when his cell phone started to ring. And when he looked at the caller ID, he was surprised to see that it was from the Lakeland Police Department. He hadn't gotten a call from them in years. So he immediately picked it up to see what they wanted. And when he did, the person on the other end introduced himself as the detective who had taken over the Linda Slayton case. The detective said they knew Grace was retired now, but they figured he would want to hear this. They said they had hired a genetic genealogist to track down family members of the killer based on that DNA profile that Grace had ordered all those years ago. And through that long and complicated process, they had finally been able to get a match. And after they got the match, they also managed to get the suspect's fingerprints. And those prints, they said, were a perfect match to the palm print that the head of the crime scene unit, Sergeant Edgar Pickett, had taken at the original crime scene 38 years earlier. Grace sat up straight in his chair and listened intently as the detective finally told him who Linda's killer actually was. And when he heard the name, he couldn't believe it. The suspect had been so close the whole time. Based on DNA, forensic evidence, and 38 years of police investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Linda Slayton in the early morning hours of September 4th, 1981. The house was all quiet as the killer waited patiently inside of Linda's closet. Hours earlier, when Linda was out at the party with her son, the killer had removed the screen from her bedroom window and had crept silently inside. And then they had hidden themselves in this closet, waiting for her to come home. The killer had been watching Linda for a while now. They had been finding ways to get close to her and her family. But Linda never really acknowledged them or paid any special attention to them at all. Tonight, though, the killer was determined to show Linda that she was not the one in control. They were. And now, the killer stood in the dark, cramped closet, holding their breath as their heart pounded in their chest. They listened as Linda opened her bedroom door and walked inside. The killer continued to wait anxiously as they heard the quiet sounds of Linda getting ready for bed, getting changed. And then, eventually, they heard the sound of the springs of the bed compressing as Linda laid down to shut her eyes for the night. And then, after the killer was sure Linda was in her bed and the lights were off and it was quiet in the room, they waited even longer, just to make sure that Linda was deeply asleep and that her children were asleep as well. And then finally, when the killer felt like they had waited long enough, they reached up and they grabbed a metal coat hanger off the hook in the closet. And then they burst out of the closet door. And before Linda could do anything, before she could make a sound or even react, she was totally caught off guard. The killer was on top of her, and they had wrapped the coat hanger tight around her throat. Linda struggled. She clawed at her own throat to try and get this thing off of her. But the killer was so much stronger than her, and there was nothing she could do. It didn't take long for the killer to have their way with Linda. And then after they were done, they strangled her until she was dead. And once the killer was finished, they hopped off the bed and just climbed right back out the same window they had come in through, and they wandered off into the night. And the killer would get to replay this crime over and over in their head all day the next day until it was time for football practice. It would turn out that Linda was murdered by her son's football coach, a man named Joseph Mills. Joseph was a fixture in Tim's life. He would drive him to and from practice every single day because Linda didn't have a car. But while Tim saw Joseph as a helpful mentor in his life, Joseph had apparently developed a dark and total fixation on Tim's mother. And during all those trips to her house to drop off her son, Joseph was planning. He was watching. He was figuring out how and when he would attack her. Back in 1981, Joseph Mills was actually interviewed by police over the phone a day after Linda's murder. But he was never really considered an actual suspect. Instead, after Joseph murdered Linda, he just continued to drive her son Tim to and from football practice every day. And Tim would, even very tragically, begin to rely on Joseph for emotional support as he was grieving the loss of his mother. He was confiding in her killer, and he just didn't know. And then, even more tragically, as time went on and Linda's case went cold, one of the pictures that Tim hung up in his bedroom to remind himself to stay positive was a picture of his football team. Tim had no idea that his mother's killer was literally standing right behind him in the back row of that very picture. In December of 2019, Joseph Mills was charged with first-degree murder and sexual battery. He was eventually sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. On the 18th of July 2019, a 28-year-old man named Andrew Harper carefully wrote a short note inside of a card. He folded it neatly, slid it into its envelope, and then handed it to a close friend who was standing nearby. With the envelope in hand and clear instructions from Andrew, the friend left the room and started walking down the long hallway. They were inside a place called the Ardington House, this beautiful historic mansion built way back in the 1700s. It sits on about 30 acres of gardens and parkland about an hour west of London, deep in the English countryside. Andrew's friend walked the length of the mansion, found the room he was looking for, and gave a gentle knock on the door. After being welcomed inside, he walked straight over to a 28-year-old woman named Lissy Beckett and handed her the envelope. Lissy and Andrew had grown up in the same small town of Wallingford. It was a quiet, rural place about 10 miles away from where they were now at the Ardington House. They had met each other when they were just 15 years old, and from that moment on, they had been completely inseparable. It was one of those rare cases of true love at first sight. And now, 13 years later, after all that time, they were finally getting married. So, Lissy took the envelope from the friend. She instantly recognized Andrew's handwriting on the outside, and a smile spread across her face. She carefully opened the letter and read the simple message inside. It just said, "Life is slippery. Here, take my hand." Now, on the surface, this little note just seemed like a sweet, romantic gesture from a man to his fiancée on their wedding day. But in reality, those 7 words perfectly captured who Andrew Harper really was. He was a protector. For as long as Lissy could remember, Andrew had always been deeply concerned with her safety, and really the safety of anyone and everyone around him. He just had this innate need to make sure that people were taken care of. As Andrew grew older, he also grew bigger. He ended up being a massive 6-foot 5-inch tall man, and this physical presence only amplified his natural instinct to protect others. He was known for being incredibly charming, friendly, and easy to talk to, but everyone who knew him also knew that in an instant he could flip a switch. He could use his big frame to step in and defend anybody who needed it, no questions asked. It was just who he was. So it came as no surprise to Lissy, or anyone else for that matter, when Andrew decided at the age of 19 to become a special constable. A special constable is basically a volunteer police officer. He joined the Thames Valley Police Department, which was the same department that looked after his and Lissy's hometown of Wallingford and all the surrounding areas. He was so good at it, so dedicated, that just 1 year later, the department hired him on full-time as a regular police constable. He was now a full-fledged police officer. Over the next several years, Andrew's work ethic and his genuine passion for the job made him one of the most well-respected and well-liked officers on the entire force. He wasn't just doing a job, he was living out his calling. In fact, just a few weeks before he sent that wedding day letter to Lissy, he had earned a major promotion. He was assigned to the Roads Policing Unit within the Thames Valley Police. This was a big deal. It meant a whole host of new responsibilities, but more importantly, it meant that Andrew would now be one of the first officers to respond to any emergency call that came in. He was on the front lines. Of course, this meant his job just became significantly more dangerous. He would be heading into unknown, high-stakes situations on a daily basis. But for Andrew, that didn't matter. The risk was secondary. To him, the most important thing in the world was protecting people who were in trouble. This promotion just gave him a bigger, better opportunity to do exactly that. So back at the Ardington house, Lissy read the note again. "Life is slippery. Here, take my hand." She set it down on the table, a huge grin on her face, and finished getting ready. A little while later that afternoon, she and Andrew walked down the aisle. In front of all their family and their closest friends, they said, "I do." And that evening, after the newlyweds shared their first dance as a married couple, they both told each other, without a doubt, that this was the happiest day of their lives. They had their whole future ahead of them, a future they had been dreaming of since they were teenagers. 28 days later, On the night of the 15th of August, 2019, Andrew was on duty. He was partnered with another officer who, coincidentally, was also named Andrew. His partner's name was Andrew Shaw. The two of them were conducting a surveillance operation in a town called Reading, which is about a 30-minute drive south of their hometown, Wallingford. Just after 11 p.m., they decided it was finally time to wrap it up and head for home. Officially, their shift had ended 4 hours earlier at 7 p.m. But Andrew and his partner were the kind of dedicated, hard-working officers who regularly put in overtime. They knew the extra hours would help their unit and their cases, so they did it without complaint. But now, at 11 p.m., they were both totally exhausted. As they were yawning and packing up their gear, Shaw, who was in the driver's seat, started the engine of their unmarked BMW police car. Once it was running, he pulled away from the curb, and they started heading north, back towards their home base. At that exact same time, not far from where Andrew and Shaw had just been, a very distressed man was on the phone with 999, the UK's emergency number. He was telling the dispatcher that just a few moments earlier, a gray sedan had pulled up his long driveway and stopped right outside of his property. This man lived on a road called Admore Lane. It was a narrow, winding, one-lane country road with very little traffic, especially at night. There weren't many houses out there, so for any car to turn onto his property would have been unusual. For one to do it in the middle of the night was instantly alarming. As soon as the man saw the headlights creeping up his driveway, he had gone to his window to watch. He was trying to figure out what was going on. Maybe they were lost? Maybe they'd turned into the wrong driveway and would just turn around and leave. But to his horror, that's not what happened. The car stopped right outside his house. The doors opened and 3 masked men got out. They were all carrying what looked like weapons of some kind. At that point, the man frantically dialed 999. As he was trying to explain the terrifying situation to the dispatcher, he was still looking out the window, and he suddenly realized what they were after. He told the dispatcher he thought they were there to steal his quad bike. The quad bike was parked right outside of his detached garage, and he could see the 3 men walking directly towards it. The dispatcher assured him that police were already on the way. But the man was getting more and more agitated. He told the dispatcher, "I can't wait any longer. I'm going out there to confront them and stop them from taking my bike." The dispatcher immediately told him not to, yelling at him to stay in the house, reminding him that the men had weapons. But he wasn't listening. He ran to his front door and threw it open. By the time he was looking outside, though, it was too late. The gray car, the 3 masked men, they were all gone. And so was his quad bike. He went back inside and got back on the phone with the dispatcher, who told him again, "Just stay at your house. The police are on the way. They'll intercept that car and they'll get your quad bike back." Seconds later, a call went out over the police radio. It was a dispatch for all Thames Valley police units in the area. The call was to intercept a gray car on Admore Lane. The dispatcher advised that the occupants were 3 masked men, that they were armed and should be considered dangerous. When Andrew and Shaw heard this call, they knew a couple of things. First, they knew they weren't the only officers who could have taken it. There were other units closer, other units on duty. Second, they knew they had been off the clock for 4.5 hours. There was absolutely no expectation for them to respond. They could have, and probably should have, just continued driving home. But they didn't hesitate for a second. When that call came over the radio, the only thing they thought about was doing their job. So, Shaw whipped the unmarked BMW around and sped towards Admore Lane. He turned off the main road, called the A4, and onto the narrow country lane heading north. As soon as they turned onto that road, their car effectively blocked the entire lane. There was no room for anyone to pass. At this point, they were fully expecting the gray car with the masked men to come driving towards them at any second. They were now the roadblock. Andrew and Shaw knew as soon as they turned onto that road that a close quarters confrontation was almost guaranteed. But if you listen to the dash cam footage from the front of their car, which picked up their voices, there's no hint of nerves. There's no fear, no hesitation in their conversation. They are calm, professional, and focused. This is what they had trained for. This is what they did. They were ready. So, Shaw is driving up this winding road. It's pitch black out. The trees on either side hang over the road, creating this dark tunnel effect. They're driving along, scanning the darkness ahead, and then all of a sudden, you can see it on the dashcam footage. A pair of headlights appears way off in the distance. And then, in a flash, that car comes bombing down the road right at them. Both cars slam on their brakes, and you can hear the loud screeching of tires on the pavement in the dashcam audio. The car in front of them comes to a full stop. Shaw stops too, but then he inches the BMW forward just a little bit more before stopping completely. Now the two cars are facing each other, maybe only 10 or 15 feet apart. It's important to remember that Shaw and Andrew's car was unmarked, and they had intentionally kept their blue police lights off as they drove up Admore Lane. They didn't want the suspects to see the flashing lights from a distance and have time to turn around and escape. So now, here they are, face to face in the dark. Andrew and Shaw are looking at the vehicle. They can see that it's a gray sedan, which matches the description of the car they're looking for. And behind the gray sedan, they can see what looks like a quad bike being towed. This is it. This is the car. There's no doubt in their minds. Shaw immediately flips on the blue emergency lights. Andrew, who's in the passenger seat, throws his door open and starts yelling at the occupants of the other car, ordering them to stay where they are. But the men in the gray car don't listen. They know they've been caught. There's a police car blocking their only way out. Their reaction is pure panic. Suddenly, one of the masked men in the back seat of the gray car leaps out of his door. He runs around to the back of their car and unhooks the quad bike. At the same time, the driver of the gray car, without even waiting for the third man to get back inside, just floors it. He tries to drive forward, going onto the left side of Shaw and Andrew's car, basically trying to squeeze past them even though there's nowhere to go but a deep ditch on the side of the road. But these guys are desperate. They're willing to do anything to get away. So the gray car lurches down into this ditch. It happens so fast that Andrew and Shaw can't do anything to stop it. At the same time, the third masked man, realizing he's about to be left behind, starts running around the right side of the police car, trying to circle around it the other way. And then, amazingly, just as this third man makes it around to the back of the police car, the gray car somehow manages to claw its way out of the ditch and get back onto the paved road. It starts speeding away from Shaw and Andrew. As it's driving away, the third man is just running down the road on foot, chasing after his own getaway car. Andrew sees this as an opportunity. He might be able to grab this third suspect who's out on foot, so he jumps out of the police car, turns, and starts sprinting down the road after them. Shaw is stuck. The road is too narrow for him to do a U-turn and drive after them. The only thing he can do is put the car in reverse, look over his shoulder, and start driving backwards down the road, trying to keep up. As Shaw is reversing, he can see the whole scene playing out through his rear window. He sees Andrew chasing the third masked man, who is in turn chasing the gray car. He's watching all of this unfold, and then something totally strange, something that seems to defy logic, happens. The third masked man suddenly leaps, as if he's trying to jump into the open window of the moving car. At the exact same moment, Andrew, who has closed the distance, kind of lunges forward to try and grab the man. And then, just as suddenly as it all happened, both men just vanish. They're gone. And the gray car just keeps driving and disappears into the darkness. Shaw is watching this, and he has no idea what he's just witnessed. He's thinking, where did Andrew go? Where did the third guy go? What just happened? But he's still in reverse, he can't stop, so he just keeps driving backwards, his eyes scanning the empty road behind him. Finally, he reaches a spot in the road that's just wide enough for him to turn the car around. As he's maneuvering the vehicle, you can hear a call come over the dispatch radio. Someone is asking Shaw for a status update, asking what's going on. All Shaw can say is, my partner Andrew has gotten out of the vehicle and I've lost him. I don't know where he is. After Shaw finally gets the car turned around, he starts driving forward back down the same creepy dark road. But now, there's nothing. It's eerily quiet. Andrew is nowhere to be found. The suspect's car is gone. The third masked man is gone. There's no one. Shaw is just driving down the road, hoping that around the next bend, he's going to see his partner running on the side of the road, or maybe find him walking back towards him. But he doesn't see anything. As he was driving, what Shaw didn't realize at first was that there were things on the road, small things that belonged to Andrew. He didn't see them in the dark, but the dashcam footage would later reveal an awful trail. First, there was his wallet, lying on the asphalt. Then, a little further down, his police badge. Then, his driver's license and other ID cards. Then, one of his gloves. Then, a piece of black plastic that looked like it had been ripped off of Andrew's tactical vest. A little farther down the road, as Shaw is still driving and scanning the darkness, he does notice something in his headlights. He stops the vehicle and gets out. The air is still and silent on this pitch-black road. He walks up to the object and sees that it's Andrew's stab vest, the protective vest he wore over his chest. He picks it up, walks back to his car, and puts it in the passenger seat where Andrew had just been sitting. At this point, you can hear over the radio, people are still asking Shaw, what's going on? And you can hear the panic rising in Shaw's voice as he reports back, I've found Andrew's stab vest. It was on the side of the road. He can't make any sense of it. He has no idea why it would be there. And dispatch doesn't know what to make of it either. So Shaw just gets back in the car and continues driving down that dark road, his mind racing, trying to figure out what was happening. Meanwhile, less than a mile away, at the end of Admore Lane, where it connects back with the main road, the A4, two other Thames Valley police cars had arrived. They had gone to that intersection specifically to cut off the gray car as it fled. They were sitting there, waiting, and looking up Admore Lane when they saw headlights bombing towards them. It was the gray car. It came speeding out onto the A4, made a hard, screeching turn, and took off. One of the two police cars immediately took off in pursuit, chasing the gray car down the A4. But the other police car stayed right where it was. Because, unbelievably, they had just spotted Andrew. It turns out, when Shaw had first put the BMW in reverse and was watching the scene through his back window, what he saw was real. The third masked man had jumped towards the moving car, and he had successfully gotten inside. As for Andrew, the reason he suddenly vanished is truly horrific. The three masked men were 18-year-old Henry Long and two 17-year-olds, Albert Bowers and Jesse Cole. All three of them had extensive criminal records, even at their young age. They proudly called themselves career thieves, which basically just meant they spent their days and nights stealing from other people. That night, they had gone out with the specific intention of stealing that man's quad bike. It's not clear how they knew he had one, but they definitely came prepared. They knew they would have to get onto his property and tow the bike away very quickly before the homeowner had a chance to react. To do this, they had attached a long, very thick rope to the back of their gray car. It was basically a big loop of rope, almost like a lasso. When they pulled onto the man's property, they had backed their car up to the quad bike, looped that strap of rope over its handlebars, and then all three of them piled back into the car and sped off, dragging the bike behind them. But when they came face to face with Andrew and Shaw on Admore Lane, they panicked. The third man, Jesse Cole, was the one who hopped out of the car.
He ran around to the back and unhooked the loop of rope from the quad bike, ditching it on the side of the road. This would make it easier for the gray car to make its getaway. Once the rope was free, the driver, Henry Long, took off without waiting for Jesse. So Jesse ran around the police car, caught up to the side of their now moving car, and leaped through the window. As soon as he was inside and Henry knew his friends were all back in the car, Henry hit the gas and accelerated hard. And standing there in the middle of all that chaos with both of his feet planted squarely inside of that loop of rope that was now dangling off the back of the gray car was Police Constable Andrew Harper. When the car suddenly accelerated, Andrew was violently swept off his feet. The rope cinched around his ankles and his legs. His head came back and smashed hard against the ground. And then he was dragged. He was dragged for 91 seconds at an average speed of 42.5 miles per hour down the entire length of Ardmore Lane. He was dragged for over a mile, whipping violently from side to side. He wasn't just being dragged along the ground, he was smashing into trees, into fence posts, into shrubs, anything and everything that lined that narrow country road. His body was being destroyed. It was only after they had dragged him for that entire mile that they finally reached the end of the road. When they pulled off Ardmore Lane and made that hard turn onto the A4, the centrifugal force of the turn swung Andrew's body around one last time. He smashed into a curb, which finally dislodged him from the rope and sent him careening into the middle of the road into oncoming traffic. At that exact moment, one of the two police cars that had been waiting there took off after the gray car in pursuit. But the officers in the other car, they saw Andrew. They saw him as he was thrown from the back of the speeding car and launched onto the A4. Initially, they actually thought the suspects were dragging a dead deer behind them. That's what it looked like from a distance, just a bloody, mangled carcass dangling behind the car. But when they ran up to see what it was, they realized with absolute horror that it was their colleague. It was Andrew. They immediately tried to save his life, performing CPR, doing everything they could. But Andrew's injuries were catastrophic. He had been torn apart. Andrew Harper died at 11:45 p.m. on the side of the A4, about 20 minutes after he and his partner had so selflessly decided to respond to that call, despite the fact they didn't have to. The three killers were arrested about an hour after Andrew died. A police helicopter had spotted their car hidden amongst some buildings about 4 miles away from where Andrew's body was found. During their trial, the three teenagers claimed that they had no idea that Andrew was attached to their tow rope as they sped down Ardmore Lane. They insisted it was a tragic accident. But the prosecution didn't buy it. They went out and meticulously recreated the exact scene that had played out. They used the same model of car, the same kind of tow rope, and a lifelike crash test dummy that was the same size and weight as Andrew Harper, 6'5" and around 200 pounds. They strapped the dummy to the back of the car in the same way Andrew had been caught, and they drove that same 1-mile stretch of road. The experts who conducted this recreation all said the same thing. It was nearly impossible to drive the car. As soon as the dummy would start to shift from one side to the other, it would tug and pull violently on the little gray car. Handling the car would have been a complete nightmare for the driver. Not only that, but the sound of Andrew's body grinding against the asphalt and smashing into trees and posts would have been extremely loud. The prosecution argued that there was absolutely no way that the three teens inside that car would not have known that a person was being dragged behind them. The prosecution also presented evidence that all along Ardmore Lane, they had found Andrew's blood on both sides of the road, high up in bushes and on trees. This indicated that the driver, Henry Long, must have been swerving violently from side to side as he drove. And according to the prosecution, the most likely reason for that was that he was trying to dislodge the person that was stuck on the back of his car. But the three teens never changed their story. They also never once said they were sorry for what happened. They showed absolutely no remorse. When the final verdict was read in court, they were found not guilty of murder. They were, however, found guilty of the lesser charge of manslaughter. For them, this was a huge victory because the sentences for manslaughter were so much shorter. When that verdict came back, the three teens were seen punching the air, cheering, and laughing in the courtroom. They were making a complete spectacle of themselves. After being led out of the courthouse, with Andrew Harper's devastated family watching them, they were smirking and smiling for the news cameras, waving, and just treating the entire tragedy like it was one big joke. To this day, none of them have ever apologized or expressed any regret for what they did. In fact, two of the killers, Jesse and Albert, have since come out publicly and said they plan to write a book about the crime, about killing Andrew Harper. And there's no indication that this book is being written because they feel bad. It seems it's being written as an opportunity to make money from their crime. Following the verdict, Andrew's wife, Lissy, was completely devastated. She was shattered not only by the loss of her husband of just 4 weeks, but also by what she saw as a total injustice. The fact that these three had not been convicted of murder was something she could not accept. She channeled her grief into action. She went on to lobby for years to pass a brand new law in the UK, which she called Harper's Law. This law would mandate an automatic life sentence for any criminal who killed an emergency worker while in the process of committing a crime. The law would not differentiate between manslaughter or murder. If you killed an emergency worker during a crime, you would go to jail for life. And this year, Harper's Law was officially passed. However, the new law will have no effect on the sentences of Andrew Harper's killers, as laws cannot be applied retroactively. Henry Long was sentenced to 16 years in prison. The other two, Albert Bowers and Jesse Cole, were each sentenced to 13 years. All three of them will be eligible for parole by the time they are 28 years old, which is the exact same age that Andrew was when they took his life. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. A woman by the name of Jeannie Hessel Schwartz, who was 37 years old at the time, was residing in Arlington, Massachusetts, year 1995. She had been in a relationship with a man named Mike Monahan for a good 10 years at the time of their engagement celebration. All indications from their close friends and family members suggested that they were an ideal match. They were in a relationship that was characterized by true happiness, profound affection, and a great deal of common ground in terms of interests. People looked at them and thought, yeah, that's exactly what I want. They were the kind of couple that other people admired. Since they had been together for 10 years, they had developed a life together, and they were looking forward to finally making their relationship official and spending the rest of their lives together. Exploring the great outdoors was one of the activities that they truly enjoyed doing together. Both of them were outdoorsy individuals who had a deep appreciation for the natural world, and they had been making preparations for a significant vacation for quite some time. The Yosemite National Park in California was their goal, and it was widely considered to be among the most beautiful and well-known locations in the entire country. Backpacking through the breathtaking wilderness, going on some sightseeing, and simply taking pleasure in the vacation from their regular lives on the East Coast were all things that were planned to be done during their time away from home. It wasn't until July of that year that they were finally able to realize their travel plans. Following the completion of their packing, Jeannie and Mike embarked on their journey to California, departing from Massachusetts. It was on the 9th of July, 1995, when they arrived at the Yosemite National Park gate. They had a sense of excitement and anticipation for the journey that lay ahead of them. A particular road that was only accessible during the summer months was the one that they decided to use in order to enter the park. The result of this was that the road was extremely silent and devoid of any activity. The majority of tourists did not use this corridor as their primary thoroughfare. This road was more distant and scenic, and it wound its way far into the high highlands of the park. During the course of their journey, they were surrounded by the breathtaking splendor of the Sierra Nevada mountains, but at the same time, they were on their own for the most part. They went for miles and miles without coming across another vehicle. Each of them, their car and the huge silent desert that stretched out in every direction, were the only things that were present. They were aware that they had approximately 2 to 2.5 hours of driving ahead of them on this route before they would arrive at the trailhead where they intended to begin their hiking excursion. They simply sat back and took it all in as they embarked on the lengthy and breathtaking journey. When they were about 2 hours into this drive, they were making their way up the twisting mountain route when they came upon a small turnout on the shoulder of the road. The location was intended for people to pull over, take a rest, and take in the scenery while they were there. In addition to the couple of other cars that were already parked there were also a few visitors who were standing around with cameras and taking in the breathtaking scenery. It had been some time since Jeannie and Mike had been in the car, and they had come to the conclusion that it would be beneficial for them to pull over, get out of the vehicle, and stretch their legs before continuing on to their conclusion. They drove their vehicle into the turnout, parked it, and then exited the vehicle. The atmosphere was fresh and unpolluted. As soon as Mike got out of the car, he remarked that he was interested in walking a short distance along a short trail that began close to the turnout. It had been mentioned to him that this specific location was an excellent location for bird watching, and he was eager to see if he could see anything that caught his attention. Nevertheless, Jeannie had a different point of view. She was more interested in a road that ran in the opposite way up towards a scenic overlook that promised an even better view of the valley below. This alternative path was more appealing to her. It was a petty argument between a couple that occurred on a regular basis. However, she was more interested in going in the opposite direction. They came to an agreement on a straightforward compromise. Every one of them would be able to do whatever they want. They came to an agreement to get apart for a mere 15 minutes. Both Mike and Jeannie would proceed to their own overlooks, and then they would meet back at the car. Mike would go to his bird-watching area, and Jeannie would go to her viewpoint. It was a strategy that was clear and logically sound. They were in a public place that was secure and had other individuals in the vicinity. After a brief gap of 15 minutes, it appeared to be perfectly innocuous. After that, they chose to go their separate ways. In the meantime, Jeannie began climbing the slope that led to the viewpoint, while Mike continued down his trail. Mike walked down the trail for approximately 15 minutes, at which time he took pleasure in the peaceful atmosphere of the forest and searched for birds. When he realized that his allotted time had passed, he turned around and headed back up to the turnout, fully anticipating that Jeannie would be waiting for him somewhere near the car. In spite of this, the location where they had arranged to meet was vacant when he arrived there. There was no Jeannie present. And this was the year 1995. During this time period, not everyone carried a mobile phone in their backpack. Mike was unable to simply take out his phone and call her in order to inquire about her whereabouts. This was the only thing he could do. Early on, he didn't seem to be particularly concerned. It is possible that she got lost in time. Perhaps the view from the overlook was so breathtaking that she simply desired to remain there for a few more minutes than she had originally planned. He leaned on the passenger side of the vehicle, took a glance around, and waited for her to emerge from the path that she had traveled. Keeping his eyes on the tree line, he was anticipating the sight of her approaching him from behind at any moment. But after another 15 minutes had passed, there was still no trace of Jeannie anywhere in sight. At this point, a tinge of anxiety began to make its way into my mind. Now, she was 15 minutes behind schedule. In his gut, he began to experience the sensation of a knot forming. He approached the group of visitors who had been present when they had initially arrived and walked over to them. He approached them and asked, "Excuse me, have you seen a woman walk by here in the last half hour?" He went on to describe Jeannie's appearance as well as the clothes that she was wearing. Although they were friendly, the tourists shook their heads in disapproval. In contrast, they informed him that they had not come across anyone who matched that description. Mike headed back to the car, and at this point, the anxiousness was beginning to truly make its presence known. He appeared to be experiencing genuine anxiety. His eyes were fixed on the trailhead where Jeannie had vanished, and he paced back and forth between the two locations. Her name was called out by him, but the only response he received was the sound of the wind blowing through the trees. There was a further 15 minutes that passed. It was now 30 minutes past the hour that she was supposed to arrive. The original plan called for a short stroll of 15 minutes, but it turned out that they had to wait for 45 minutes. After a while, he realized that he could no longer just stand there. Something has to be done by him. He made the decision to proceed up the path that she had walked, assuming that she might have injured herself by tripping and falling, or perhaps she had simply been a little disoriented. However, as soon as he began climbing the trail, he became aware that he was facing a challenge. Almost soon, the main trail ended up branching off into a number of other smaller routes that traveled in a variety of various places. It was completely unknown to him which way she had gone. Every single one of them was a possibility for her to fall. During that brief period of time, he stood there, experiencing a flood of hopelessness wash over him. He was well aware that it would be a poor decision for him to walk aimlessly down these trails by himself. It was possible for him to become disoriented, and he was squandering valuable time. He was aware that he required assistance at this point in time. In a circumstance such as this one, time is of the utmost importance. Every minute that went by may have been extremely important. It was at the turnout that he made his turn and sprinted back to his car. Upon his arrival, he observed a member of the Park Service taking a trash can and emptying it into a dumpster, which was located a short distance away. It was a fortunate turn of events. A voice filled with terror could be heard coming from him as he ran over to the employee. His explanation of the problem was as concise and unambiguous as he could make it. "My fiancée Jeannie, she's missing," he responded. "She went for a walk up that trail and was supposed to be back 30 minutes ago. She's gone. Can you please get in touch with the authorities? We need to get people up here looking for her right away." The park employee could see the genuine fear in Mike's eyes and immediately understood the gravity of the situation. "We need to locate her as soon as possible." They listened to the radio and broadcasted it to the world. After Mike had finished his conversation with that worker, the first park rangers had already climbed the mountain road to reach the turnout. This occurred within 45 minutes. Mike was found there, pacing impatiently near his car. They found him there. When they started talking to him, they were able to acquire a better understanding of what had occurred. Jeannie, what she was wearing, and the precise location where she had gone were all questions that they requested him to answer. In the meantime, they made an effort to maintain his composure as they began their preliminary investigation of the situation. As they made their way up the path that she had traveled, the rangers began yelling her name and scanning the territory immediately surrounding her. On the other hand, after looking for an hour without discovering anything, the rangers realized that this was more than just a case of a hiker losing track of time. The call was placed in order to ensure that more aid from the police was sent in. The hunt for Jeannie Hessel-Schwartz was about to start in earnest, and it was going to become the largest search and rescue operation in the history of Yosemite National Park in a short amount of time. In a short amount of time, what started out as a modest and localized search conducted by a few park rangers suddenly expanded into a vast operation. An immense 40 square miles of rough and harsh terrain was added to the search area, which was enlarged to encompass the entire area. Helicopters were brought in, and as they hovered low over the dense forest canopy, their crews scanned the ground for any trace of color or any sign of a human who shouldn't be there. Their rotors thumped through the air as they swooped low over the forest canopy. On the ground, the number of people searching for the missing person increased into the hundreds. A large number of devoted volunteers, as well as park rangers and police officers, had arrived to offer assistance before the incident occurred. Those who managed dogs arrived with their highly trained search and rescue dogs with the expectation that the dogs would be able to detect Jeannie's smell and guide them to her whereabouts. The entire region was teeming with people, all of whom were working toward the same objective, which was to locate the woman who had gone missing. The enterprise served as a shining example of both dedication and efficiency. They had a command post set up, and they methodically divided the search area, which was 40 square miles in size, into a grid. To ensure that no stone was left unturned, teams were allocated to each sector of the grid, and they proceeded to search through it in a methodical manner, shoulder to shoulder. However, in spite of the extremely rapid response time, the enormous quantity of manpower, and the utilization of every resource that was presented to them, they were unable to locate anything. Despite the fact that they were fatigued and disappointed, the searchers continued to go out at daybreak and return at nightfall each and every day. Jeannie was nowhere to be found by them. The only pieces of potential evidence that they were able to locate after 2 hard weeks of this persistent searching were 2 solitary boot prints that they suspected belonged to Jeannie. They were the only pieces of evidence that they were able to find. The initial footprint was discovered in the soft ground not too far away from where Mike's car was parked, which was specifically in the general region of the location where she had been seen the last time. It was clear that this print was correct. A track from her could be found in the exact location that one would anticipate finding it. The fact that she had, at the very least, begun her walk from that location was verified by this indication. However, it was the second boot print that caused the investigators to be extremely perplexed. The second print was discovered on a route that was located some distance away. Nevertheless, this was not a typical unmarked path of any size. In that particular section of Yosemite National Park, this was one of the largest and most well-established routes, irrespective of the fact that it was wide and that it was extremely well marked with signage. There was no way that you could have mistaken it for anything other than a primary path. As you may anticipate, the footprint of Jeannie's boots was not discovered as she was going along the trail. On the contrary, the print demonstrated that she was cutting across it in a straight line. It appeared as though she had emerged from the thick woodland on one side of the track, stepped onto the path, and then promptly moved straight over and back into the dense woods on the other side of the trail. This second print was completely incomprehensible to the knowledgeable searchers and park rangers who were employed in the search. They had witnessed the behavior of people who are lost, and this was not it. If you are lost and disoriented in the middle of the woods, and you happen to stumble upon a clearly defined and major trail, it is the same as discovering a lifeline. It is an indication of the development of civilization. That path should be followed, since it is the logical and intuitive thing to do. After deciding which way to go, either left or right, you would proceed to travel along the route until it ultimately brought you to a road, a building, or other individuals with whom you would interact. Each of the primary routes in a park such as Yosemite is intended to go to a certain destination. Never in your wildest dreams would you stroll directly across a major trail and then immediately dive back into the wilderness that is devoid of any trails on the other side. For the sake of survival, it was entirely counterintuitive. In light of this, the finding of this print raised a significant amount of questions. Some of the detectives first believed that it was impossible for it to be hers because it appeared so out of character for a person who had been lost. However, the print was identical to the shoes that she was wearing, both in terms of size and tread pattern. That was her own print. That one piece of evidence revealed that Jeannie was not thinking like a typical lost person, or that something else totally was going on, was the only thing that could be considered plausible. It was a particular aspect that did not go well with the straightforward storyline of a hiker who failed to take the correct path. An additional, very peculiar and unsettling piece of information surfaced during those 2 weeks of searching, and it was revealed by the people who were handling the dogs. There were a number of different search dog teams that had been brought to the turnout where Mike and Jeannie had parked their vehicle. In this location, which was the starting point, Jeannie was proven to be the last place she was. After allowing the dog to sniff the item that contained Jeannie's fragrance, the handlers would then give the dog the command to track the item with its scent. However, each and every time they attempted to do this, the dogs were unable to detect a scent trail that appeared to be going away from the vehicle. They would smell about the vehicle, including the area where Mike claimed she began her walk, but they were never successful in determining what they were looking for. The scent that they were able to follow was never detected by them. According to the knowledgeable dog handlers, this was a significant warning sign. Someone told me that even if a person had been gone for days, a well-trained dog should be able to pick up at least some trace of their scent at the beginning location, particularly if they had traveled away from that spot on foot. This is especially true if the person had been gone for a long time. And very gloomy conclusion was reached by the handlers as a result of the absence of any scent trail at all. Eventually, they came to the conclusion that Jeannie had never in fact been present at that location. Alternatively, to be more specific, the fact that she had never walked away from that parking lot on her own before, this judgment reached by the people who handled the dogs, caused the investigation to shift its whole focus. In the event that she never left the automobile, what caused her to vanish in the first place? Those in charge of handling the investigation recommended to the primary investigators that Mike Monahan might be lying. The reasoning behind their opinion was that the entire tale of her going for a walk for 15 minutes was a fiction. They were under the impression that it was likely that Jeannie had been affected by something that had occurred either before they arrived at Yosemite or while they were still in the automobile. This whole missing hiker situation was nothing more than an elaborate scheme, a cover tale that he had concocted in order to get away with whatever kind of wrongdoing he had committed against her. When it comes to situations like this one, the spouse or partner is nearly always the first person the police look at. This was a concept that gave me chills. In addition, they now had a compelling motive to look at Mike in an extremely close and careful manner. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, also known as the FBI, became engaged as soon as it was officially suggested that there was foul activity involved. The investigation was now being handled as if it were a possible case of kidnapping or homicide. Immediately after taking control of the situation, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, brought Mike Monahan in for an interview and requested that he undergo a polygraph examination, also known as a lie detector test. There is no doubt that this must have been an even more terrifying experience for Mike. In addition to the fact that the woman he had loved his entire life had vanished, he was now being investigated as the primary suspect in her disappearance. He was in a state of mourning and he was afraid, but he was aware that he had nothing to conceal. Without any reservations, he gave his consent to take the examination. The FBI investigators started interviewing him after he was connected to the equipment and the system was turned on. They questioned him about his connection with Jeannie, about the events that took place on that day, and the direct inquiries such as, did you have anything to do with Jeannie's disappearance? Do you know where she is? Mike responded to each inquiry in a calm and consistent manner. And once the examination was finished, the results were crystal clear and free of any ambiguity. Without any doubt, Mike had successfully completed the polygraph examination. The investigators came to the conclusion that he was telling the truth. He was completely exonerated of any role in the matter. That was not the end of the FBI's investigation after the polygraph test. Both Mike and Jeannie were subjected to a comprehensive and detailed background check by the organization. They investigated each and every facet of people's lives. They investigated their assets and liabilities, as well as their phone records and the connections they had with their family and friends. They spoke with a large number of persons who were familiar with them. They searched for any indication of difficulty, any secret, and any reason for their actions. Existed a lover who remained hidden? A large insurance policy was there. Were they in a financial bind? Were there any individuals who might have harbored resentment toward Jeannie or Mike before? On the other hand, during their inquiry, they found nothing at all. All of the people they talked to shared the same opinion. Mike and Jeannie were a loving, stable, and happy couple. Their foes were unknown to them. There was no evidence that they had been experiencing any kind of difficulty in their lives that could have resulted in something like this. In light of this, the authorities found themselves back at the beginning of their inquiry, which had lasted for several weeks. Although Mike had been cleared, Jeannie had not yet returned. No leads, no suspects, and no answers were found in the investigation. In a location that was both one of the most beautiful and one of the most deadly on the planet, she had suddenly disappeared into thin air. 21 days had passed. The extensive search had been terminated on the spot. The attention of the national media had begun to wane. The incident of the woman who went missing in Yosemite National Park was old news for the entire world. However, the nightmare continued each and every day for Mike Monahan and Jeannie's family who were affected by it. Then, on September 3rd, about 2 months after Jeannie had vanished, 2 guys were trekking in a very isolated region of Yosemite National Park. They were looking for Jeannie. They were fishing enthusiasts with years of expertise, and they were going to a remote location that they were familiar with in order to do some fishing. A place like this was never visited by tourists who were just passing through. In a rocky and difficult to reach region of the park, it was located in a remote area that was not easily accessible. They were on their way along a creek when they gazed into a pool of water and saw something that caused them to come to a complete and utter halt. There was a human body there. Almost quickly, the 2 men fled the location and went to inform the park authorities about their situation. A recovery team was sent to the area, and the findings that they discovered would finally provide an answer to the mystery of what had happened to Jeannie. However, the discovery would also reveal a whole new set of questions. It was determined that Jeannie Hessel-Schwartz was the person whose body was found. As the crow flies, she was discovered around 3 miles away from the turnout where Mike had seen her the last time. The only items of clothing she had on when her body was found were her socks and one of her hiking boots. None of the other boots were present. She had been submerged in that body of water for a considerable amount of time, most possibly throughout the entirety of the 2 months that followed her disappearance. A definitive cause of death could not be determined by the medical examiner since the body had been submerged in water for such a lengthy period of time, which caused the decomposition process to progress to an advanced stage. There were no clear evidence of trauma, such as a gunshot wound or a stabbing, but it was impossible to rule out other types of injuries or even drowning since there were no visible signs of trauma. Despite the fact that the place where her body was discovered made the circumstances surrounding her murder much more perplexing, the discovery of her remains brought an end to one chapter of the mystery. Investigators initially hypothesized that she may have become disoriented, strayed along a river or a brook somewhere upstream, and then drowned after falling into the water. This was the initial speculation. The current would have dragged her body down the waterway until it eventually came to rest in the pool where the fishermen discovered her. Her body would have been carried by the current. This appeared to be a horrific accident that could have been real. It would explain how she got to be in such a different place than she had started from. However, the officials of the park and the search and rescue crews that were familiar with the area swiftly disproved that hypothesis. They stated that it was extremely unlikely to occur. They indicated that the creek that flowed down to the location where she was discovered was not a river that flowed smoothly and without obstructions. The creek was a tangled mess of natural waste, and it was located in the mountains. Massive rocks, downed trees, and areas with a shallow depth were also present. They were adamant that a human body floating downstream would never have been able to make it all the way to that particular pool under any circumstances. Long before it ever arrived at that location, it would have been entangled on a log, caught up in a rock jumble, or beached in a shallow region. All of these things would have happened. It seems inconceivable that her body could have been transported there from the location where she was reported missing. In light of this, the investigators were faced with a significant challenge. In the event that she did not arrive at that location by chance, the sole other explanation would be that she had arrived there on foot. However, this appeared to be even more improbable. We conducted in-depth interviews with the fishermen who discovered her body and asked them about the site. They said that the only way to reach that particular body of water was to either climb up a steep cliff face from below using professional climbing equipment, or to rappel down a cliff face from above, once more using ropes and climbing equipment. Both of these methods were necessary in order to reach the pool of water. They characterized the region as a location that would only be visited by rock climbers who had much experience. In point of fact, the only reason they went fishing there was because they were climbers themselves and possessed the necessary gear and expertise to access the area. In order for Jeannie to have arrived at her destination on her own, she would have been required to descend a cliff face that was nearly 2,000 feet vertical. Since she was not a rock climber, she did not have any climbing equipment with her at the time. Only hiking boots were on her feet at the time. It seemed inconceivable to think that she could have successfully descended a perilous cliff that was 2,000 feet high. It was a feat that even a class scubber with a high level of expertise would find exceedingly challenging, if not impossible, to do without the specific gear that was required. So since she couldn't have floated there, and she couldn't have walked or climbed there on her own, it left a third, more ominous possibility: she was carried there. The conclusion that she must have been kidnapped was reached as a result of this. Someone may have assaulted her at the turnaround and then brought her to this extremely distant place in order to conceal her body before bringing her there. This theory, however, was flawed in a significant way that appeared to be insurmountable. This would imply that her assailant would have been required to carry her down the same 2,000-foot cliff, either while she was still fighting back or after she had already passed away. Can you even fathom the logistics of that? Attempting to maneuver a tricky and perilous fall down a vertical rock face while carrying the dead weight of an adult lady could be considered a challenging situation. This appears to be just as implausible, if not more so, than the idea of her driving herself to the destination. In addition to being physically taxing, it would be an extremely dangerous endeavor. To what extent would a murderer go to such severe and perhaps hazardous lengths in order to dispose of a body? Yosemite National Park included thousands of square miles of wilderness that could be used to conceal a body with significantly less effort and risk than other places. When it came to a murder, the site was completely inexplicable. Therefore, when confronted with the sheer impossibility of the area where she was found, all of these straightforward explanations, such as an accident, a solo travel, or a homicide, appeared to break apart. The officials were at a loss for words. They were able to locate Jeannie, but they were not any closer to comprehending the manner in which she had passed away or the manner in which she had arrived in a location that she had no rational method of accessing. The case was a mystery that could not be solved in any way. A professional tracker who had been engaged in the investigation from the beginning came out with a notion that was more unusual after all of the traditional ideas had reached a point where they could not make any further progress. It was not with the intention of searching for Jeannie that this tracker returned to the location where she had vanished. Rather, it was with the intention of attempting to comprehend the surroundings from the point of view of someone who was disoriented and lost. A portion of their time was spent in the woods next to the turnout, where they observed and listened and it was at that moment that they were aware of something really unusual. When the wind blew through the leaves of a particular cluster of aspen trees in the exact correct way, it produced a sound that was remarkably similar to the sound of cars passing by on a paved road. They discovered this cluster of trees, an aural illusion was being created. According to the tracker's hypothesis, it was possible that this sound was involved in the events that transpired with Jeannie. In their novel theory, they proposed a step-by-step reconstruction of what might have occurred in the event in question. In this scenario, Jeannie goes for a walk, but she ends up getting lost and going in the opposite direction. As it begins to get darker, a feeling of terror begins to take hold of the situation. In a forest that she is not familiar with, she is alone herself, and she is unsure of which path to choose. It is then that she becomes aware of it, in the stillness of the evening. Her brain immediately recognizes the sound as that of a road at that moment. She is under the impression that she is hearing the sound of cars, which is a symbol of civilization and safety. She then begins to move in the direction of the sound. The tracker believed that this would provide an explanation for the unexplained second boot print that was found somewhere along the major path. When she was in a condition of terror and fixation, her entire attention would have been focused on that sound which signaled the presence of a road. It is quite unlikely that she would have recognized the actual trail as a route leading to safety if she had encountered it in its physical form. In her view, the only thing that mattered was the music that was being made. As she sought the source of the sounds that she believed to be her salvation, with unwavering determination, the actual trail was nothing more than an obstacle that needed to be overcome. She would have continued to follow the sound of the wind in the trees, thinking that it was a road, which would have led her farther and further into the wilderness, according to this scenario. At some point in time, her walk would have brought her to the brink of the enormous cliff that overlooked the region where her body was ultimately discovered. The darkness, the fact that she was bewildered, and the fact that she was still following the misleading sound all had the potential to cause her to slip and tumble over the edge. After that, her body would have been found in one of the rivers or pools that were located at the base of the cliff. This waterway would then have connected to the canal that went to the location where the fishermen found her. At first glance, it appeared that this hypothesis might explain a great deal. In addition to providing an explanation for why she would cross a major trail, it also offered a reasonable explanation for how she could have arrived at the base of that enormous cliff. The catastrophic event was brought on by a moment of terror and a sensory illusion that occurred at the same time. However, even this generally accepted explanation contained a huge error, and once again, it originated from the park administrators who had an in-depth understanding of the topography of that cliff. The straightforward slip and fall component of the story was met with skepticism from them. They made their way to the peak of the cliff and drew up a plan for the following steps. They came to the conclusion that it would not have been a straightforward case of her walking too close to the edge and slipping in order for her to have fallen from the top and landed in the particular length of water that would have connected to the location where her body was discovered. The cliff's base was a vast area of rock and scree that extended down the slope. It is highly likely that she would have been traveling forward with a large amount of forward momentum in order to clear that area and land directly in the ocean. If someone had done it, it would have been more of a jump than a fall. In order for her to arrive at that particular location, it appeared as though she would have had to perform a running jump off the edge of the cliff instead. In addition, that particular aspect brought all of the questions flooding back. At the same time, the concept of Jeannie, who was disoriented and in a state of panic, racing at full speed and then jumping from a cliff in the dark, did not appear to make any sense. It appeared to be excessively severe and deliberate. Is it a desperate act, or was she being forced to do it? She appeared to be fleeing from something. The investigators were left with a sense of discomfort and a collection of concerns that remained unaddressed, even when they considered the most feasible scenario. There has been no formal resolution reached regarding the case of Jeannie Hessel-Schwartz. We are left with a ghost story that takes place in one of the most breathtaking national parks in the United States. How exactly did she find herself in that pool of water that was unreachable to her? The fact that the highly trained search dogs did not pick up her scent at the car is a detail that initially raised suspicions about her fiancé and has never been fully explained. I don't understand why she went back into the woods after crossing that clearly defined track, which is a lifeline for any hiker who gets lost. The question is, what was the cause of her falling down that cliff that was 2,000 feet high in a manner that shows it was more than just a simple fall? There has never been any resolution for Mike Monahan, the individual who waited for 15 minutes, which turned out to be a lifetime of inquiries. Despite the fact that he was exonerated of any crime, he was unable to find a way to explain the disappearance of the woman with whom he had spent 10 years of his life to any reasonable explanation. It is a chilling reminder that even when a person is found, the actual truth of what happened to them can often remain lost forever in the wide, silent wilderness. Her death is a reminder of this. You are very much appreciated for watching. If you watched today's program, please share your thoughts with me in the comments section. You should also keep in mind that we have a whole playlist of episodes of True Crime ready for you to watch in one sitting right now. Up until the next time. What's up?
On the morning of the 26th of June 1826, Samuel Willie Jr. opened his front door and immediately realized how close his family had come to dying. Overnight, a violent storm had torn through New Hampshire's White Mountains with such force that it looked like the entire mountain had exploded around their home. The river in front of the house had burst over its banks. Entire trees had been ripped out of the ground. Thick mud and shattered rock covered the property in every direction. Standing beside him in stunned silence, his wife Polly whispered something Sam did not want to admit might be true. Moving their family into this isolated mountain pass may have been a terrible mistake. Just a year earlier, Sam had abandoned the ordinary life of a farmer to chase something bigger. Deep in a dangerous stretch of wilderness known only as the Notch, he believed he could build a famous inn for travelers, artists, and adventurers passing through the White Mountains. But now, as he stared at the devastation left behind by the storm, that dream suddenly felt fragile. Because what frightened Sam most was not the destruction itself. It was the terrifying realization that the mountain behind their home had nearly killed them once already and might not miss the next time. And that wasn't all. The sheer volume of water had also triggered a rock slide from the steep mountain slopes that loomed right behind their house. So now, their yard and the adjacent fields were littered with huge rocks, thick mud, and entire trees that had been ripped from the ground, roots and all. As Sam's eyes scanned the devastation, he did see a small silver lining. Luckily, the main path of the slide had missed their house and the barn where they kept their livestock. But it had only missed them by a few feet. It was an incredibly close call. Even so, the structures themselves had sustained damage from the wind and the rain of the storm itself. Windows were cracked, shingles were missing. He knew he would have to repair all of it. So, Sam stood there, 100 thoughts racing through his mind, trying to calculate how much time and, more importantly, how much money it was going to take to clean all of this up. It seemed like an impossible task. And as he was thinking, he heard Polly next to him mumble quietly to herself that this had all been a really bad idea. Sam let out a long sigh. He knew exactly what she was talking about. She was referring to their decision to move their entire family out here to the Notch in the first place. And at that very moment, staring at the awful destruction that was laid out right in front of him, he had to admit that she was probably right. This might have been a terrible, terrible idea. You see, up until about a year before this, Sam and Polly and their 5 children had lived a very different life. They had a small farm about 20 miles away from where they were standing now. It had been a quiet life, a cozy life. But Sam had always had this nagging feeling deep down that he was meant for something more. He wanted to do something more exciting, more ambitious than just being a regular old farmer. And when he saw this house in the notch, he thought he had found it. He saw an opportunity for a grand adventure and also a pretty good opportunity to make some real money. In this part of the White Mountain Range, there was a single road about 12 miles long that cut directly through the range from one side to the other. And the Notch house, their house, was located almost exactly in the middle of that long road. But you have to remember, this was the year 1826. So when we say road, it was really more like a glorified trail. It was mountainous, it was rocky, and it was so treacherous that neither horses nor wagons could make it all the way through without stopping. Because of this, travelers were typically on foot, and there was literally nowhere for them to stop and rest on that entire 12-mile stretch of road. Nowhere, that is, except for the Willie's Notch house. Sam had realized right away how valuable this property could be. If he could just fix it up and convert it into an inn, it would be the only place for travelers to get a hot meal and a warm bed. But he had even bigger aspirations for the place, beyond it just being a simple pit stop. He wanted to turn it into a true destination. After all, the White Mountains were known for being incredibly beautiful, and the specific spot where the Willies lived, in the Notch, was no exception. Their house was situated right on a riverbank, nestled in a deep mountain valley. It was surrounded on all sides by dense woods and towering, mist-covered peaks. It was honestly a breathtaking view. And as soon as Sam had first laid eyes on it, he knew. He knew that this place could become a famous destination for poets and authors and artists. It was the kind of place people would write songs and books about. In his mind, it was absolutely perfect. But so far, his dream of making a life out here at the Notch house had been a whole lot of hard work. The house itself was large, but it was really old. And it had been completely abandoned for quite a while before he and his family had moved in. So it was in really bad shape, quite dilapidated. To help with the massive amount of work, Sam had hired 2 men to live on the property and help him fix it up. And together they had already done some significant work to expand the house and the barn to be able to accommodate more travelers. But Sam knew he still had a very long way to go before the Notch house could be considered some kind of artist's retreat. And now, with this extensive new damage from the most recent storm, he had even more things to add to his never-ending list of repairs. But he also had to admit to himself that the property damage was actually the least of his problems. Because as he and his wife Polly stood there, looking around at the aftermath of the storm, he knew that deep down, he was lucky. He was lucky their house was even still standing. He was lucky that he and his family were even still alive. That storm had been catastrophic. And as Sam thought about how close they had all come to death, his heart began to race. He started to wonder if maybe Polly was right. Maybe they really should just pack up the family, abandon this dream, and go back to the simple, safe life of farming. But leaving felt like admitting failure. His big dream would be over before it even really began. There would be no artist retreat, no tourist mecca. He wouldn't be some creative benefactor. He would just be a farmer again. So he took a deep breath, turned to his wife, and asked her to please, please just give this place one more chance. He promised her that he would do everything he possibly could to not just repair the property, but to make it safe and secure so it could withstand whatever the mountain decided to throw at them next. And Polly, she hesitated for a moment. But ultimately, she believed in her husband. She trusted him. And so she nodded in agreement. For the next 2 months, Sam and his 2 hired workers labored practically around the clock. They worked from sunup to sundown, repairing all the damage from the storm. They fixed up broken windows and replaced missing shingles. They cleared away all the rocks and fallen trees, which was an exhausting task that took forever. And then, once all the immediate repairs were finally done, Sam kept working. But now he focused his energy on improving the property, on making it stronger. As the weeks turned into a month, and then two, he worked tirelessly to build his family a truly secure home. He wanted them to be much safer against any future storms. He reinforced the walls of the house and built a whole new, stronger roof. He even started to map out different disaster scenarios in his mind so that no matter what happened, he and his family would always be prepared. One particular disaster scenario that he was especially concerned about was the large boulder that was situated on the mountainside directly behind their house. It was a massive piece of granite the size of a small cottage. He was worried that if there was another big rock slide, that boulder might just break free, topple onto their home, and crush them all in an instant. He and his workers tried to figure out a way to move it, but they soon realized that was impossible. The boulder was just way too big, too heavy. But in the end, they found a very creative way to make sure it would not be a danger to them. And while Sam did all of this hard work, he started to feel a lot better about everything. Each security measure he put in place, every new nail he hammered, was proof to him that he didn't have to sacrifice his ambitions for his family's safety. He could have both. A few weeks later, on the night of August 28th, Samuel Willie stood by a downstairs window watching another wild storm rage outside. Heavy rain was pummeling the glass, and Sam could hear the powerful wind battering the sides of the house, making the whole structure groan. It was pitch black outside, but every now and then, a brilliant burst of lightning would flash across the sky, lighting up the entire valley for a few terrifying seconds before it plunged back into darkness again. And each time this happened, a deafening crash of thunder would follow, a sound so loud it seemed to shake the house right down to its very foundation. Behind Sam, in the kitchen, Polly was gathered with their 5 children and the 2 men that were working on the property. They were all sitting around the kitchen table. Polly and the kids in particular were very, very scared. The whole group of them were reading Bible verses out loud, their voices trembling in these frantic, hushed tones. It was like they were trying to will the storm to be over, trying to cling on to their faith and pray that they would all be okay. Sam could hear the fear in his wife's voice, and he really couldn't blame her. This was quite possibly the strongest storm that either of them had ever seen out here. It was even bigger, even more violent than the one that had completely destroyed their property over the summer. The rain seemed impossibly powerful, coming down so hard and so fast that the river had already overflowed its banks. And each time there was a flash of lightning, Sam could see that the water levels were getting higher and higher almost by the second. And so Sam, he was admittedly quite scared himself. He was trying to keep it hidden, to be the strong father and husband, but his heart was racing and he was deeply anxious. But at the same time, he told himself that this was the moment he had prepared for all summer long. This was it. He had done so much work to make sure this house was a safe place during storms, and he felt like they should be okay. But at the same time, the deafening sounds from outside and the terrified voices of Polly and his children were making it really, really hard to believe that was actually true, that they were really safe here. So for a little while, Sam just kept his vigil, looking out the window, listening to his family praying behind him. But then eventually, he turned around, and as calmly as he possibly could, he told them all to go to bed. He said it was going to be fine. He would stay up and keep watch through the night. Polly, who was visibly still very scared, just nodded. She got up and went off with the kids. And for the next few hours, Sam stayed at his post by the window and watched the storm. And for the most part, there wasn't a whole lot of drama. I mean, it was incredibly loud and windy. It was obvious the river was flooding. He knew there was going to be more damage to clean up tomorrow. But Sam was starting to think that, maybe they were going to get through this thing. But then, a little after midnight, Sam heard a sudden, extremely loud banging sound from outside. He froze, because he knew instantly it was not thunder. It sounded more like a huge explosion. Almost immediately, Sam knew what it had to have been. The barn. The barn must have collapsed. And the thought that this storm had just taken out an entire building, a building that he himself had reinforced, turned Sam's worry into outright panic. and so Sam screamed for his wife and the workers and his kids to wake up. He yelled that it wasn't safe. Get away from the windows. We have to find cover. And so for the next few seconds, the family and the workers, all 9 of them, were frantically scrambling around the house in the dark trying to find a safe spot, but they didn't know where it was. But as they were sort of navigating through the chaos, trying to find the right place to go to weather the storm, Sam heard an even louder bang. And then there were screams all around him. And then he felt himself go airborne as a heavy object slammed into his back. The following evening, an exhausted traveler named John Barker walked down that very same road, heading in the direction of the Notch house where the Willies lived. John was a merchant, and he was passing through the White Mountains on his way home after a long business trip. He had made this trip many times before, so he knew the road well. But the road he was on now was barely recognizable. It was flooded in many places, and there were rock slides and debris everywhere. The journey was slow-going and pretty miserable. But he knew that at the halfway point was this house, the Notch house, where Sam Willie and his family lived. He knew they were in the process of converting their house into an inn for travelers. And even though it wasn't fully established yet, John was confident that he could probably get into that house, get a hot meal, and rest for a little while before he had to make the rest of his journey. But when he finally rounded the corner into the valley where the house was, he just froze. The entire area was a complete disaster. The river had clearly and completely flooded, and now half the land in front of him was just underwater. There had also clearly been a huge rock slide. The barn was only half standing, a skeleton of what it once was. And the field in front of the Willies' home was completely buried in tons of rocks and other mountain debris. But the truly astonishing thing was that right in the middle of all this destruction and ruin, the Willies' house was still standing. And as John carefully maneuvered his way closer to it, he realized it was more than just intact. The house was pristine. There wasn't a single thing broken or out of place on it. Not even a single window pane was cracked. Relieved and a little bit amazed by this miracle, John hurried right up to the entrance and knocked loudly. But no one answered. So eventually, he just turned the knob, found the door was unlocked, and opened it. He poked his head in and called out to Sam. But he didn't hear anything. No sound of a reply, and no sound of anyone moving around inside. So John tentatively stepped all the way into the house and just kept calling out to the family as he walked from room to room. But he quickly realized the house was completely empty. It was also a bit of a mess. There were clothes scattered all over the floor, and the beds and sheets had been yanked around and were messy. And on the kitchen table, the family Bible was wide open. John stood there in the middle of the empty home, trying to work out what could have possibly happened here. The mess suggested that, clearly the family had been here somewhat recently, but they must have left in a great hurry. So John guessed that they must have gone down the mountain to wait out the storm somewhere else, maybe at a neighbor's house or at the tavern that was miles away at the end of the road. And since the Willies were not here to give him permission to stay, John needed to figure out what he was going to do. He didn't really like the idea of sleeping in their home without them there, but he really had nowhere else to go. It was almost nighttime, and he could barely manage the ruined road during the daylight, let alone in the dark. So, even though he felt kind of bad about it, he picked a bed and tried to get some rest. But just as he began to drift off to sleep, he heard a deep, guttural moaning sound coming from somewhere outside the house. John immediately shot up, fully awake, and rushed over to a window. But he couldn't see anything. Night came really fast in the White Mountains, and it was now almost completely dark outside. He waited, listening, to see if he would hear anything else, but he didn't. So he decided he must have imagined the sound, and he turned to go back to bed. But as he did, the moaning started again, and this time it was louder, closer. John gasped as a terrible thought occurred to him. He wondered if maybe that sound was one of the Willies. He wondered if maybe they hadn't actually left the property after all, but were maybe outside somewhere, injured or in trouble because of the storm. So John sprinted outside into the darkness. But again, it was pitch black, and he didn't have any kind of light to help guide his way. And so once he was out there, he just began shouting, calling out to whoever it was, asking if they needed help. And eventually, the horrible moaning sound answered him. But the sound kind of echoed all over the valley, so John couldn't pinpoint exactly where it was coming from, other than it was clearly outside somewhere in the debris. After frantically looking around and not finding whoever it was, John realized that finding the injured person was going to be impossible right now. It was just too dark, and he would unfortunately have to wait until the morning. So, very reluctantly, John went back inside the house. And for hours, he just sat there in bed and listened to the pained moaning continue outside. Finally, in the morning, when the first bit of sun peeked over the mountain ridge, John hurried right back outside to look around. And this time, he very quickly found the source of that moaning sound. It was one of the Willie's oxen. It was moaning in pain from being trapped under some heavy debris near the ruins of their barn. John immediately rushed forward and began hauling the heavy wooden planks and rocks off the poor animal. And after he had finally freed the ox, it amazingly staggered to its feet and just hobbled away into the woods. It was basically okay. But after it was gone, John felt this sort of sick uneasiness settle over him. Even though the sound had just been from an ox and he had saved it, he just felt like there was something deeply wrong here. And so he decided that he had to go and see the Willies with his own eyes just to make sure they really were okay. So, even though it was really early and John was still very tired, he immediately gathered up his things and set off down the ruined road. Hours later, around noon that same day, John Barker finally staggered out of the mostly destroyed mountain pass and made his way towards the tavern at the bottom of the road. When John stepped inside, he was utterly exhausted. He was drenched from the awful journey he had just taken. But more than that, he was really worried about the Willie family. Because as he had made that trip down the road, he had passed by the neighbors' homes along the way, and he had kind of expected to see the Willies taking shelter in one of them. But no, the Willies were not in any of the neighbors' homes. And in fact, basically none of the neighbors were in their houses either. They were all here, in this tavern. It was like everybody who lived on this road had come to this tavern to wait out the storm. But when John looked around the crowded room, he could tell right away that the Willies were not there either. And this made John's stomach drop. Because if they weren't at their house, and they weren't in any of the neighbors' homes, and now they were not in this tavern with the rest of their neighbors, that had to mean something was very wrong. And so John actually called out to the entire room and asked if anyone had seen the Willies since the storm. And the tavern got really quiet as all of its occupants all began looking around at each other, seeing if anybody had any information. But eventually, everyone just shook their head and said, "No, we don't know where they are." And that's when John said to the crowd that, well, the Willies are missing. A few hours later, a 12-man search party left that tavern and headed right back up the road towards the notch. They were led by one of the Willies' neighbors, a man named Edward Melcher, who lived at the base of the mountain on a farm with his family. The recent storm had done quite a bit of damage to Edward's property as well. And so he and his family, like most other people that lived in this area, had gone to the tavern to seek shelter. Edward and his family, much like the Willies, were good people who were just trying to carve out a living in this harsh part of the world, and there were not a lot of people doing that. This was a very small, tight-knit community. And so they always helped each other out whenever they could. And so, this was no exception. But, as desperately as Edward and the rest of the search party wanted to get to the Willies' property and find these people, it took them so long to navigate the destroyed road that by the time they actually got to the property, it was after midnight and really too dark to look for anything. So they just went right into the Willies' house to wait until morning. Once he was inside, Edward could see that the home really was just as John Barker had described it. It was sort of a mess inside, but there was absolutely no damage to it from the storm. Edward had heard that Sam was really freaked out about a storm that they had had earlier that summer. And because of that storm and because of the damage it had done, he had gone way out of his way to really develop his property to prepare it for the next big storm. And it seemed like all of his preparations and all the reinforcements on his land had paid off, because here his house was, standing tall and completely unharmed. But that was also kind of confusing. It's like, if you prepared this house so well for a storm, and clearly it was able to withstand the storm, why on earth did the Willies leave? As Edward continued to walk around the silent house, he saw that the Willies' Bible was still lying on the kitchen table, wide open. And when he leaned over and read the passage that was on the page, he couldn't help but shiver when he saw what it said. It said, "The Lord also thundered in the heavens, and the highest gave his voice, hailstones and coals of fire." Hours later, when the sun finally began to come up, Edward and the others went outside and began searching the devastated property for any sign of the Willies. And over the next few hours, the original party of 12 grew as more and more people showed up to assist in the search. By this point, word had spread pretty far about the family's disappearance, and so residents from all over the White Mountains had come here to help. And eventually, hundreds of people were combing the mountainside, looking for the Willies, or at least to find a single clue about where they might have gone. At around noon, when still absolutely nothing had been found, Edward decided he would go search closer to the river, since by this point the water levels had gone down some. And when he got to the water's edge, he began to hear this strange, low buzzing sound. And so he followed it. And eventually, he saw something poking out from behind some debris. And when he saw what it was, Edward began to scream for help. The thing that Samuel Willie was most afraid of happening in a large storm was a massive rock slide, especially with that huge boulder positioned right behind his house. But when Sam realized it was going to be impossible to move that boulder or to otherwise shield his family from falling mountain rocks, he came up with what he thought was a pretty creative solution. He built a whole second, smaller shelter, a safe place that he and his family could run to if there was a bad storm. And when that second, more violent storm hit, the one that had caused all this damage and had led to the Willies' disappearance, well, during that storm, Sam had started screaming for his family to take cover, to get away from the windows. He had heard that crashing sound outside that he was convinced was the sound of his barn collapsing, and he was sure his house was next. He was yelling for them all to take cover. Well, the family listened to him. And together, all 9 of them did exactly what he said. They left the main house and they ran towards that second shelter, the one they believed was better protected from a potential rock slide. But unfortunately, this would be a catastrophic, fatal mistake. Because that humongous boulder that sat right behind the house, the one that Sam feared so much, was not actually a safety risk. In many ways, it was a protective barrier. When there was an actual massive rock slide during this horrible storm, all of the rubble, the rocks and trees and mud actually hit the backside of that giant boulder and split into 2 separate streams. The flow of the avalanche was diverted around the boulder, and in doing so, it did not strike the house at all. And so, in essence, this boulder that Sam had been so worried about basically made the Willies' original home the single safest place to be on the entire property. But unfortunately, Sam and his family did not stay there long enough to realize that. They ran out of the main house as a big group, and as soon as they were outside, they ran directly into the path of the rock slide and were all instantly killed. Eventually, the residents of the White Mountains would find the family. The buzzing that Edward had heard was actually a group of flies gathered around a single human hand that was reaching out from underneath the rubble. In the end, because of this immense tragedy, the area became a famous tourist destination, just like the Willies had originally hoped it would. People from all over the country heard about the family and what had happened to them. And before long, artists and authors were coming to the White Mountains in droves to see the site of the tragedy for themselves. And some of them even wrote books and poems about it. And so, in a sort of cruel twist of fate, Sam's dream did come true, just not in the way he ever could have hoped. On one of the last nights in December of 1678, a woman named Marie Bosse sat at a large table at a friend's dinner party in the city of Paris, France. The table was crowded with other party guests, and they were all listening intently to Marie as she told story after story about her life and her career. Marie was a fortune teller, which meant, at least according to her, that she could read people's futures, usually by looking at the lines on their palms or by using special crystals. And Marie was actually quite good at doing this, in the sense that whenever she told someone what their future was going to be, she was typically right. Which was why, out of the more than 400 other fortune tellers in Paris at the time, she had some of the best and most important clients in the whole city. People like members of royalty and the wives of very high-ranking government officials and other very wealthy people from high society. And it was a very big deal for Marie to even be in the same room as some of these kinds of people because she did not come from money. In fact, there was a time in her life where she had almost had to live out on the streets. Years ago, when her husband had died unexpectedly, she was left all alone with her 3 children and really no way to provide for them. But she had worked incredibly hard, and she had actually ended up thriving. Her kids were all grown up now, and she had turned her fortune-telling talents into a real, profitable business. She had been so successful, in fact, that she was really maybe just 3 new clients away from being able to retire comfortably. And Marie was not the kind of person to just sit back and wait for those clients to magically find her. She was a self-made woman, and she knew it was very important to go out and find those clients herself. And so, that's exactly why she was at this party tonight. It was being hosted by a friend of hers who was also in the fortune-telling scene. And so, many of the guests who were sitting at this table were new potential clients that Marie really hoped to impress. So that's what Marie was trying to do now, to be very impressive. She was telling the other guests all of these incredible tales about working with the rich and the famous. But the problem was, in addition to these fabulous stories she was telling, what was also coming through very clearly to her audience was that Marie was very, very drunk. Marie was a loud and talkative person in general. And that extrovert attitude really helped her get clients, typically. But when she got drunk, she was even more talkative than normal. And sometimes it also made her a little bit inappropriate. Right now, though, she felt like she was on a roll. Her stories were drawing gasps and laughs from the crowd, and the guests were pushing her to tell them more and more. But there was at least one person in the crowd that seemed to be bothered by what Marie was saying. It was the hostess of the party. The hostess kept silently glaring at Marie from the other end of the table. It was like she was trying to silently tell her to shut up. But Marie just figured she knew why the hostess was acting that way. The hostess was also a fortune teller, and so she must just be jealous. Marie was getting all of this attention and all these potential new clients, and this wasn't even her party. She had to be jealous. So Marie ignored the glares and just kept on talking until dinner was finally over. And then after that, the party ended, and Marie staggered off to bed. When Marie woke up the next day, her head was absolutely pounding and her stomach was in knots. She was severely hungover from all the drinking she had done the night before. She didn't remember a whole lot about what had happened, but she did remember telling a lot of stories. And she remembered that while she was telling these stories, the hostess was angrily glaring at her the entire time. And now that she was sober, a terrible thought popped into her head. She wondered if maybe she had said or done something that was embarrassing. What if the table wasn't laughing with her? What if they were laughing at her? And what if the hostess glaring at her was some sort of signal to stop because she was hurting herself? And so this thought that somehow she had done real damage to her reputation, to her career from being too drunk, continued to weigh on her throughout the entire day and into the following evening. Until that night, when she was in her kitchen making some dinner with her adult daughter, and there was a knock at her door. Marie hurried to open it up, and when she did, she found a young woman standing on her front steps. The woman seemed incredibly nervous. She kept fidgeting with her hands and smoothing down her hair. She told Marie that she had gotten her name from someone Marie had met at that dinner party, and she was hoping that Marie could help her. And when she heard this, Marie smiled and exhaled out all the tension that she had been holding on to for the last day. This was a huge relief to Marie. It was proof that the dinner party had not been a total embarrassment after all. Despite the hostess glaring at her the whole time, clearly, here she was, getting a new client. She must have impressed at least this one woman, and maybe they were more like her. The party had been a success. So, very excitedly, she invited the young woman inside and led her to the specific area of her home where Marie conducted her business and read people's fortunes. This room had lots of strange objects placed all around it, like jars filled with mysterious liquids, and crystals, and bottles of potions, and decks of cards, all designed to make the area feel mystical and authentic. The two of them eventually sat down at Marie's small table in the middle of this room. And once they were sitting, the woman told Marie that she did want her fortune told. She said she had a terribly abusive husband, and she wanted to know how much longer she would have to put up with his cruelty. This didn't surprise Marie at all. She had seen a lot of nervous, frail women just like this one, women who were completely trapped in their marriages. In France at this time, divorce wasn't even legal, which meant you were stuck with your partner for life even if they were abusive. And so a lot of these women who were in this terrible position turned to Marie, desperate to be told what the rest of their lives looked like, and if their lives would continue to be so terrible and hard because of their partner. Marie knew that really, what these women were looking for was some sense of control. They hoped that if they just knew what their future looked like, even if it was bad, they could somehow do something to change it. And so Marie, she reached out and she gently grabbed this woman's hand. She turned it over and she began to study her palm. Marie was trying to get a sense of what the future held for this woman by reading the lines on her hand. And pretty soon, Marie got this feeling in her gut. She felt sure that this woman actually was going to be okay. And so Marie told the woman that her husband's abuse would end very soon. Then she gave her some tips on what to do in the meantime. The woman was visibly relieved and thanked Marie profusely. And then when she was gone, Marie smiled. Not just because she had helped this woman, but also because after this job, Marie would only need 2 more clients before she had enough money to finally retire. A few days later, on January 4th, Marie woke up to somebody banging on her door. She figured it must be a very desperate new client, so she rolled out of bed and started walking to go answer it. But before she could get there, the door flew open and the Parisian police poured inside. Marie staggered back and just stared at them in complete and total shock. She had no idea what they were doing there. But they immediately just grabbed her and told her she was under arrest. Marie screamed in protest and said there had to be some kind of mistake here. She hadn't done anything wrong. And when they didn't listen to her, she got furious and demanded to be released. She told them that she was Marie Boss, and that she had friends in high places, like in Parliament and in noble circles. She said they could all vouch for her, that she was an honest person who just worked hard and was good for her clients and good for the city. But as she was ranting and raving, one of the officers stepped in front of her. And without reacting at all to what she was saying, he just showed her an object that Marie instantly recognized as having come from her fortune-telling room. And at the sight of this object, her heart sank, and she stopped struggling. Because Marie knew that she was now in very, very big trouble. And if she was in trouble, then so were many, many other people in Paris. After Marie was arrested, she was brought to a prison in Paris called the Bastille, where she was interrogated by torture. And since Marie was already a talker by nature, she quickly told the police everything they wanted to know. And after Marie did that, all hell broke loose. Hordes of police officers fanned out through the entire city, charging into homes and businesses all around Paris, arresting civilians, business owners, and housewives. Then they flooded the hall of the city's government and demanded that high-ranking officials in Parliament surrender their wives to the authorities, throwing the entire Parisian government into absolute chaos. And even after all of that, the authorities still weren't finished. They left the city and began forcing members of the French nobility out of their castles to go and face charges in the city. Months turned into years, and the arrests continued to pile up, and each one was more shocking than the last. Until the investigation led authorities to the actual royal palace in Paris and to the king's own favorite mistress. By the time the police finally finished their investigation, hundreds of people all across France, ranging from commoners to literal royalty, were either facing serious charges or were sitting in jail cells. and screams filled the halls of these prisons as the arrested were tortured for whatever information they might have. Scores of people fled the country in terror. And then eventually, all around Paris, these enormous pyres were built in the public squares. And one by one, dozens and dozens of people were led out to these pyres, strapped to the poles in the middle of them, and then burned to death in front of thousands of Parisian spectators. And it was all because of Marie. So, Marie Boss was not just a fortune teller. She made her real money by making and selling poison. And it would turn out that she was not the only one. In fact, at the time, you could say that Paris basically ran on poison. Since the late 1660s, according to one estimate, around half of the people who lived in that city, from housewives to literal royalty, had either poisoned someone or had been poisoned by someone else. It had become absurdly common for people, especially rich people, to buy poison from Marie and the network of 400 or so other poisoners around the city and use it to quietly commit murder so that the victims' deaths looked natural. But poison was not just used to kill people. It was sort of used as a solution for many kinds of problems. Like people who wanted their romantic interests to be easier to seduce, well, they'd buy poison and use it on them. Or people that had abusive or unappealing partners, they would use poison to make them sick and bedridden because remember, they couldn't get divorced. So, if you were stuck with somebody and you didn't like them, well, you could just poison them. It was also alleged that King Louis XIV himself was being poisoned in non-fatal doses by his mistress, who wanted to make him easier to manipulate. Poison was even used for pure entertainment. One duo of poisoners baked deadly substances into cakes and then handed them out to unsuspecting patients at a local hospital just to see what would happen. The poison affair, as it came to be called, was without a doubt at the time Paris's biggest and best-kept secret. Until Marie went to that dinner party, got really drunk, and let it slip. That night, Marie had told stories of poisoning people, and the other guests thought they were so funny because they didn't believe they were true. But one of the guests saw that the hostess of the party looked furious at Marie the whole time Marie was telling these wild stories. And so he started to wonder if maybe what Marie was talking about might actually be real, and that the hostess was trying to signal her to stop talking about it. But Marie was not taking the hint. So the following day, that dinner guest went to the police. And the police sent a woman to Marie's house to act as an undercover spy to see if maybe she could get proof that the poisonings were real. And lo and behold, when this woman told Marie that her husband was abusive and she just wanted to know how long this was going to go on for, Marie, she read her palm and she read her future, but then she also gave her some tips about what to do in the meantime, which included handing her a vial of poison and saying, just go ahead and kill your husband. Poison him. The object that officer had shown Marie when she was arrested was that very same vial of poison. The investigation into the poison affair lasted for 3 years. And during that time, there were over 300 people who got arrested, from commoners all the way up to royalty. 23 of those people were banished from the country, and 34 people were executed, including Marie Boss. She was actually the first person to be burned alive on one of those pyres. Cases like these remind us that sometimes the most dangerous thing in the world isn't evil, it's fear, desperation, or one terrible decision made at exactly the wrong moment. If you enjoyed today's episode, let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more strange and unsettling true stories, we have an entire playlist waiting for you right now. Sometimes we look for solutions to our problems in the most unusual places. We might seek out a new technique to manage pain or a quick way to solve a financial problem. We do it because we think it's going to make our lives better, easier. But what happens when that so-called solution, the very thing that's supposed to help you, ends up being the worst thing that could ever happen? What if that fix, that shortcut, leads directly to a tragic end? Today, we have 2 stories about people who found solutions to their problems, but these solutions came with a cost that no one could have ever predicted. On the 15th of March 2011, just after 1 in the afternoon, 16-year-old Marcus Freeman was behind the wheel of his dad's pickup truck. He was driving down a highway in Northport, Florida, with his girlfriend Carly beside him. A song he loved came on the radio, and he started belting out the lyrics, and Carly joined right in with him. They had just come from the dentist's office where Marcus had gotten some dental work done. His jaw was really starting to ache, a deep, throbbing pain that was hard to ignore. The singing was mostly a way to distract himself from it, and for a little while, it was working. But every time a song would end and a commercial would come on, the pain would rush back, and it was all he could think about. But Marcus wasn't your typical 16-year-old. He was used to dealing with discomfort, both physical and mental. He had been working really hard to become the kind of person who could push through pain. He was the starting quarterback for the varsity football team at Northport High, and that came with a lot of pressure. Over the past year, he had gotten serious about his physical fitness. He was doing these incredibly difficult, vomit-inducing workouts to get stronger and faster. He knew that physical toughness was part of the game. And then there was the mental side of things. Being the quarterback, all eyes were on him. The nerves before a big game could be overwhelming. He felt a general level of anxiety that a lot of high performers feel. So, he had started working with a school counselor to develop techniques to manage those nerves, to stay calm under pressure. So, dealing with pain, whether it was the ache in his muscles after a workout or the anxiety in his chest before a game, was something Marcus was actively working on. He was a very forward-leaning kid, always trying to improve himself. And all of this hard work seemed to be paying off in a big way. The Northport High football team, which had been terrible for years, was now coming off one of their best seasons ever, and a lot of that was because of Marcus's leadership on the field. But it wasn't just the football team that was on an upswing. The entire school seemed to be transforming. For a long time, Northport High had a bad reputation. The sports teams were bad, graduation rates were low, and test scores were in the basement. It just wasn't a great place to be. But now, it felt like Leaning Corn had totally turned a corner. It wasn't just football. Other sports programs were improving too. Student grades and test scores were going up across the board. And maybe most importantly, the students just seemed happier. There was a better energy in the hallways. It wasn't just Marcus who was thriving, it felt like everyone was. And if you asked anyone at Northport High why this was happening, they would all give you the same answer. There was one person to thank for this incredible turnaround, their principal, George Kenny. Mr. Kenny had been the principal for about a decade, but in the last few years, he had really changed things up. He introduced new ideas to the curriculum and put a huge new focus on providing individual support for every student. He wanted each kid to feel seen and heard and helped. And the results seemed to speak for themselves. The whole school was flourishing under his leadership. But right now, as Marcus drove down that highway, none of that was on his mind. The only thing he could think about was the searing pain in his jaw. It felt like it was getting worse with every passing second. It was no longer just an ache, it was a sharp, throbbing pulse that was starting to make him feel dizzy. But Marcus had been working on pain management. He had his techniques, the same ones he used to push through exhaustion on the football field or to calm his nerves before a big play. He was going to use those techniques now. As Carly sat next to him, he took a slow, deep breath and tried to relax his body. He tried to just breathe and let his mind go somewhere else, anywhere else but the pain. This was literally what his counselor had taught him. He would do this mental exercise where he would let his mind drift away from the physical discomfort, focusing on something else entirely. It was almost like a form of meditation, and it usually worked for him. He could find a way to push through. But this time was different. It just wasn't working. The pain in his jaw just kept hammering away, and he couldn't get it out of his head. Soon, it felt like the pain was growing, radiating up from his jaw, across his cheek, and into his entire head. It was becoming completely overwhelming. But he stayed focused. He kept trying to separate his mind from the pain. And then, all of a sudden, the throbbing stopped. Just like that, it was gone. And Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him. While Marcus was going through this intense internal battle, Carly was in the passenger seat fiddling with the radio dial. She was trying to find another good song they could sing along to. Carly loved spending time with Marcus. She liked him so much that she had just tagged along to his dentist appointment just so they could hang out a little longer. She thought he was incredibly kind and funny. When she was with him, they could talk and laugh for hours, and it would feel like only a minute had passed. But as she was searching for a new station, she realized Marcus had gone completely silent. It was unusual for him. She looked over at him, and what she saw made her gasp. Marcus seemed to have gone totally rigid. His arms were locked straight out in front of him, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were turning white. His head was tilted back slightly, and his eyes were starting to roll back into his head. He was staring up at the ceiling of the truck, not at the road. Carly started screaming his name, trying to snap him out of it. "Marcus! Marcus, what are you doing?" she yelled, clapping her hands and shaking his shoulder. But he didn't answer. He didn't even seem to hear her. He just stayed in that bizarre, stiff state while the truck continued to speed down the highway at nearly 100 miles an hour. Panic set in. Carly was screaming, grabbing at his arm, trying to get him to look at her, to move, to do anything. But it was like he wasn't there anymore. It was like he was gone. Then Carly turned her head and looked through the windshield. Her scream turned into one of pure terror as she saw the truck was veering off the road, heading straight for a large tree on the shoulder. The impact was instant. And for Carly, everything went black. A few hours later, Carly's eyes slowly opened. Her entire body ached, and her head was pounding with a dull, heavy rhythm. At first, she had no idea where she was. Then she heard the steady beeping of machines next to her. She looked around the room. It was stark white. She realized she was in a hospital. And as soon as she made that connection, the entire horrible memory came flooding back. She remembered Marcus, the strange way he looked, stiff and unresponsive at the wheel. She remembered the crash, the sound of metal hitting the tree. As she was trying to process it all, a nurse came into the room. Carly's first words were about Marcus. "Where is Marcus?" she asked. "Is he okay? Can I see him?" The nurse had a very gentle, sad look on her face. And that's when Carly learned the devastating truth. Marcus was dead. Almost a month passed. It was April 8th, and Carly was back at Northport High School, sitting in her Spanish class. She was trying her best to focus on the teacher's lesson, but concentration was something that just didn't come easily to her anymore. Physically, her injuries from the crash had healed, but emotionally, she was still in pieces. Marcus's death had completely shattered her world. But maybe the hardest part of it all was that there was no explanation for what had happened. Why had he been acting that way right before they crashed? What had happened to him in that truck? It was a huge, unanswered question that hung over everyone. The official story in the media was that Marcus had simply lost control of his vehicle. But Carly knew that wasn't right. She was there. She saw what happened. Marcus went into some kind of trance, and it was that frozen, rigid state that caused the truck to veer off the road at 100 miles an hour. There was no bad weather that day. There were no obstacles on the road. Whatever caused Marcus to freeze up was what caused the crash. But nobody was talking about that part. It felt like nobody even understood it. Of course, there were theories floating around, especially at school. A lot of students thought that maybe Marcus had received some kind of sedative at the dentist and had a delayed bad reaction to it while he was driving. Others wondered if he had just had some sort of random, sudden medical event, like a seizure or a stroke. But when the results of his autopsy were released, it put those theories to rest. There was no trace of any drugs in his system, and there was no indication that he had suffered a stroke, a seizure, or an aneurysm. So, those explanations were ruled out. Because the crash was considered a tragic accident and not a case of foul play, the police weren't investigating it any further. They had been at the scene, they had documented what happened, but there was no deeper investigation to find out why it happened. For Carly, this was a difficult reality to accept. She knew it was possible that she, and everyone else who loved Marcus, might never get the answers they were so desperate for. It might just remain a mystery forever. And it was so hard to go back to normal life, to sit in class and pretend to be a regular kid again, when there was this giant hole in her life that felt like it would never be filled. But Carly wasn't the only one grieving. Marcus had been an incredibly popular and well-loved student at Northport High. After their principal, Mr. Kenny, had announced his death to the student body, there was an outpouring of grief. There were memorial services and student gatherings. Mr. Kenny made sure that grief counselors were brought into the school to help students process the terrible loss. And so, as Carly sat there in her Spanish class trying to listen, the school's announcement system crackled to life. It was Mr. Kenny's voice. He said he had something to tell them. Carly could tell immediately from his tone that it wasn't going to be good news. Normally, Mr. Kenny was an upbeat, enthusiastic person. His voice was usually full of energy. But right now, it sounded solemn, and there was a slight tremor in it as he spoke. He started to say something, then he stopped himself and cleared his throat. And then he just said it. Another Northport student has just died. In the weeks that followed that awful announcement, Carly tried to make sense of how it was even possible. 2 students from their school had died in less than 2 months. This second death was different from Marcus's. It was self-inflicted. But still, Northport was a small, tight-knit school. This was not a place where young people just suddenly started dying. It just didn't happen. But then, just a few weeks after that, in early May, Carly's confusion turned into complete and utter disbelief. Another Northport student died. This death was also self-inflicted. The news sent Carly and the rest of the already fragile student body into a state of shock. 2 deaths so close together had been hard enough to process, but 3 was just unthinkable. A dark cloud seemed to settle over the entire school. It felt like the entire student body was on edge, almost bracing for more bad news, as if more death was just inevitable. One night, not long after the 3rd death, Carly was at home in her room, scrolling through Facebook on her computer. She came across a post from one of her classmates. It was a short post, but when she read it, she couldn't believe she hadn't thought of it herself. The post pointed out that all 3 of the recent deaths had one very specific thing in common. So many people at Northport High, from students to staff to parents, believed that the school's recent incredible improvements were all because of their principal, Mr. Kenny. He was known for being very student-focused, for giving kids a lot of individual attention to help them succeed. But Mr. Kenny also had a secret. For the past 3 years, Mr. Kenny had been holding private meetings with students and staff members to help them with their personal issues. Things like anxiety, pain management, mental health struggles, trouble concentrating, or improving test scores. He was working with them one-on-one to help them become the best versions of themselves. And to do this, he was putting them under hypnosis. Mr. Kenny would invite students, sometimes as many as 2 a day, into his office for these private recorded hypnosis sessions. He did the same thing for teachers who were struggling. He even sometimes brought entire sports teams into his office and would hypnotize them all together before big games to help them improve their performance. But there was a critical detail here. Mr. Kenny didn't just perform the hypnosis himself. He also taught the students how to do it on their own, how to perform self-hypnosis. The problem was, Mr. Kenny had only ever taken a very brief course in hypnosis. He had no license to be using it as a therapeutic tool to diagnose or resolve actual mental or physical health issues. He was not qualified or licensed to be doing this. But for a while, it seemed to be working. A lot of kids responded really well to his sessions. They reported feeling less anxious, more focused. Some of the athletes started excelling in their sports like never before. But along with these positive results, there were also some very alarming side effects. Some parents at Northport reported that their children started having strange personality changes after they began hypnosis sessions with Mr. Kenny. They said their kids would sometimes just get these blank stares on their faces. Others said that after a session, their child would seem disoriented, or they would start doing things they would never normally do. Some even began talking about hurting themselves. And so, after the third student death, that Facebook post that Carly saw had revealed the one thing that connected all three tragedies. All three of the students who had died had been repeatedly hypnotized by Mr. Kenny. Now, Mr. Kenny swore that he was not responsible for their deaths. But he was ultimately charged with practicing therapeutic hypnosis without a license, and he received a year of probation. The Sarasota County School Board also paid a total of $600,000 to the families of the three victims. As for Mr. Kenny, he has since retired from teaching. The solution he offered his students, a way to manage their pain and anxiety, had become an unimaginable tragedy. While that principal's solution led to disaster, in our next story, a man's own solution to his problems would bring him face to face with a consequence he never, ever saw coming. Shortly after 8 o'clock at night on the 9th of October, 1996, a 31-year-old man named Anthony Irvin was walking down a dark sidewalk in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He was heading towards a local grocery store. It wasn't freezing out, but there was a chilly wind blowing and it was pretty dark. Anthony only had a light jacket on, and he was starting to feel uncomfortable. He pulled the thin jacket tighter around himself as he walked. All he wanted to do was go home where it was warm. But he couldn't do that. Not yet. First, he needed money. Once he had money, then he could go home. Anthony had lived a pretty rough life. For the most part, he was a career criminal. He hadn't held down a regular job in a very long time. Instead, whenever he needed cash, like he did tonight, he would either steal from a local business or he would mug someone on the street. Over the past 9 years, he had been arrested 8 separate times for crimes like robbery and assault. To the people in his neighborhood, he was mostly just a huge nuisance. Even if some of them felt sorry for his situation, he was still a problem. But despite how often he committed these crimes, they were always relatively petty. So, he never served very much time in prison. He always ended up right back out on the street, and he always ended up right back to his old ways. But tonight, as Anthony walked down that empty road, he wasn't thinking about how his actions affected his neighbors. He was just thinking about finding a place or a person to rob. And tonight, he decided he was going to look for a person. He needed a target. As he walked, he actually started to get a little worried. The street seemed quieter than usual. There was almost nobody out. He started to think that if he didn't find someone soon, he was going to be out of luck for the night. No money. But just then, he saw someone up ahead. A young man turned the corner and started walking up the sidewalk, right in Anthony's direction. He looked like a smaller guy, younger, and he was all by himself. And right away, Anthony thought, perfect. This is my mark. I'm going to rob this guy. So Anthony started walking towards this unsuspecting young man. As he got closer, he had a sudden realization. He knew this person. It was his neighbor, Harry. And Anthony thought to himself, oh, this is even more perfect, because he knew Harry. He knew that Harry was super soft-spoken and gentle. He was a calm person. He's not going to put up a fight. He's going to be so easy to rob. Sure, it was a terrible thing to do, to rob your own neighbor. Harry would know it was him. But Anthony figured, what's he going to do about it? So Anthony marched right up to Harry and stopped directly in front of him, completely blocking his path on the sidewalk. And then Anthony delivered his classic, time-tested mugging threat. A few minutes later, a detective with the Philadelphia Police Department named Perry Kelly was driving his cruiser fast down a city street. He had gotten a call about a mugging in progress, and he was hoping he could get there in time to catch the person responsible or at least get a look at them before they got away. So Kelly turned a corner and pulled up in front of the address he'd been given. As his headlights swept across the sidewalk, he saw 2 men. One of them was lying motionless on the ground. The other one was sitting right on top of him. And Detective Kelly's first thought was, perfect. I got him. He assumed the man on top was the mugger. He had caught him in the act. He was about to jump out of his car and make an arrest. But he was wrong. When Detective Kelly got out of his car and learned what had actually happened there, it would turn out to be the single strangest thing he had ever encountered in his entire 25-year career. So, when Anthony mugged people, he had a specific method he always used. He would put his hand deep into his coat pocket and press his fingers forward, making it look like he was holding a gun inside the pocket. He would aim his hand towards his target and say something like, "Hey, I got a gun. Give me all your money or I'm going to shoot you." And it usually worked. People would look down, they'd see the bulge in his jacket that they thought was a gun, and rather than risk it, they'd just hand over their wallets. It wasn't worth finding out if the gun was real or not. Anthony would grab the money and take off. He was thinking that this exact trick would work perfectly on Harry. This meek young kid would be an easy score. So he walks up to Harry, stands in front of him, and blocks his way. Harry, who hadn't seen him coming, actually bumps into him and seems confused. And that's when Anthony delivers the line. His hand is in his pocket, pretending it's a gun. "Hand over all your money or I'm going to shoot." But Harry, whether he believed Anthony had a gun or not, had no way of seeing it to confirm. Because Harry was blind. And Anthony knew Harry was blind. They were neighbors. In Anthony's mind, that's what made him such a perfect victim. He was going to rob the small blind kid from down the street. That was his plan. But what Anthony didn't know, what he couldn't have possibly known, was that in addition to being blind, Harry also happened to be a karate master and a master wrestler as well. So when Harry was suddenly confronted by a man telling him he was about to be shot, his self-defense instincts took over instantly. He grabbed Anthony, flipped him completely over his shoulder, and slammed him hard into the concrete ground. The impact broke Anthony's neck, and he was killed instantly. And then Harry simply sat on top of his body and waited for the police to arrive. Harry was never charged with any crime in connection with Anthony's death. It was clearly determined that he had acted in self-defense. And even though the media at the time called him a hero for what he did, Harry himself felt terrible that he had killed Anthony. He never meant for that to happen. He was just protecting himself. He later called the whole thing a tragedy. It leaves you wondering how many other solutions are out there just waiting to become someone's greatest tragedy. But after hearing these stories, you will wonder, how many times do we often trust something just because it is said to help us? And how do we know when a solution has quietly crossed the line into something dangerous? Currently, we are constantly seeking quicker solutions for stress, pain, and pressure. The real question is whether we are solving our problems or just handing them over to things we don't fully understand. Thank you so much for watching.